Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where ancient stories get comfortable, mysteries settle in like old friends, and the past opens itself slowly, gently, almost as if it's been waiting for you specifically to arrive tonight. I'm glad you're here. This evening's quiet journey takes us into a world older than memory, older than myth, and older than the idea of gods themselves. We're going to walk carefully into the deep waters of the earliest Mesopotamian imagination, where creation wasn't yet a story, just a vast presence, drifting, breathing, stirring. Tonight, we'll be exploring the tale of Tiamat, the primordial being who gave birth to the first gods, the one whose ancient name floats through clay tablets like a whisper of something enormous beneath the surface. Before we wade into those waters, though, I'd love to know where you're listening from, whether you're curled up under blankets, settling into bed, or maybe unwinding in a quiet corner somewhere. It's always fascinating to imagine these stories being heard all across the world at the same moment. And what time is it for you right now? Perhaps it's late and you're ending your day, or early and the world around you is still waking up. Whatever the hour, I hope this brings you a sense of calm. If you find this soothing or interesting, or just a pleasant way to drift into rest, a like or a subscribe would mean a great deal. It helps this little place of calm continue to reach others who might also enjoy these peaceful dives into history. For now, settle in, breathe a little slower, and let the noise of the day fall away somewhere behind you. We're about to step into a story that predates almost every other story humans ever told. A story from a time when people tried to understand existence by imagining what came before everything they knew. It's strange to think about what the world was like before humans wrote the first words, built the first cities, or gave names to the sun, the moon, and the sky. When the earliest people along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers wondered how the world came to be, they didn't have telescopes or scientific theories or diagrams showing planets swirling around stars. What they had was their imagination, shaped by the landscape that held them, rivers that flooded and receded, storms that rolled across the plains without warning, oceans and deserts that seemed endless. They lived in a world that could be gentle one moment and terrifying the next. It made sense for them to believe that the universe began with something vast and powerful, something that held both creation and danger within it. They imagined a beginning not as a single event, but as a kind of presence, a boundless ocean stretching in all directions, silent and deep. This was Tiamat, not yet a goddess in the way later stories would describe her, but a being that represented the raw materials of existence itself. She was the saltwater sea before seas existed, the deep before the sky had even been separated from the waters. Before any god had a throne or a name or a story, Tiamat was already there. The earliest people saw water as the source of life, partly because everything around them depended on it, and partly because water was the most mysterious thing they knew. It could give life through rivers and rain, but it could also take everything away in a flood. When the Sumerians and later the Akkadians pictured the beginning of all things, they didn't imagine it in the form of a person or an object. They pictured it as water mixing with more water, fresh with salt, calm with restless. From that mingling, they believed, the first gods slowly emerged, and Tiamat, the vast sea, was their mother. Not in the soft, gentle sense of motherhood that later myths sometimes portray, but in the immense and powerful sense of a force that creates because it cannot help but do so. As generations passed, people began shaping Tiamat into something more familiar. They gave her a personality, a voice, a will. They imagined her moving through the waters, watching over the developing world, creating new beings. She wasn't just a passive ocean anymore. She became a being with thoughts and intentions, capable of feeling both contentment and anger. These early myths weren't written with the precision of modern stories. They were retold countless times, shifting with each storyteller, changing with each town and each group of travellers, taking on new shapes as cultures blended. But through all these shifts, Tiamat remained the central presence in the earliest creation story. a being of such scale that even the gods born from her later struggled to fully comprehend her. Creation stories across the world often begin with some kind of infinite emptiness or a quiet darkness. But in Mesopotamia, the beginning wasn't empty. It was full to the brim, full of water, full of possibility, full of life waiting to unfold. Water was everywhere in the landscape, shaping the rhythm of daily survival, dictating when crops could grow and when they would fail. It's no surprise that the people believed the world rose out of a sea that was both nurturing and unpredictable. They saw Tiamat in the floods that brought fresh soil to the fields. They saw her in the storms that gathered strength far away and arrived with thunderous force. They even saw her in the distant horizon, where the edge of the world seemed to dissolve into mist. When the earlier scribes finally carved these myths into clay tablets using cuneiform script, they captured a story already ancient by their time. These tablets, especially the ones that would become known as the Enuma Elish, tell of a time before time when nothing yet separated sky from sea. No mountains rose from the earth, no valleys existed, no animals walked or flew, no humans tended fields or built cities. In that stillness, only Tiamat and Absu, the freshwater presence, existed. Together they formed the first pair, not in the romanticized sense, but as two primordial forces whose mingling lay the groundwork for everything else. The fresh and the salt, the calm and the restless, the soothing and the unpredictable. In their mixture, something new stirred. It's remarkable that so many cultures created stories about a vast ocean as the original birthplace of existence. Even without knowledge of evolution, or the biological origins of life, ancient people everywhere came to similar conclusions that water must have come first. For the Mesopotamians, this wasn't just symbolic. They lived between two rivers, surrounded by marshlands and seasonal floods. Water wasn't an abstract idea. It was the reality that shaped their seasons and their survival. So when they imagined the beginning of the universe, they imagined it starting the same way their world started each year, with rising waters bringing renewal, with the promise of life carried in currents. Tiamat emerges from these early stories not as a villain or a gentle caretaker, but as something more complex. She is creation, in motion. She is the force that births gods without fully controlling what they become. She is the mother of beings who eventually grow powerful enough to challenge the very one who brought them into existence. And that tension between creation and rebellion is at the heart of many myths around the world. The idea that the newer generation eventually clashes with the one that came before. The idea that creation can lead to conflict, that maker and made are bound together in ways that are often difficult. As we drift further into this ancient world, it's important to understand that Tiamat's story is not simply a tale of a monstrous being defeated by a heroic god. That's the simplified version that survived because later empires found it politically convenient. The original story was more layered. It reflected the complicated relationship ancient people had with the natural world. Their world was neither kind nor cruel. It simply was. Tiamat represented that duality. When she created the first gods, she wasn't acting out of affection or duty. She was embodying the unstoppable force of existence expressing itself. When later stories describe her turning against those gods, it wasn't because she was evil. It was because order had emerged from her chaos, and the balance between those forces was shifting. A careful reading of the tablets shows that Tiamat existed long before any concept of morality was attached to her. She wasn't judged through the lens of good or bad. She was understood through the lens of inevitability. Everything came from her and everything eventually returned to her. Even in her eventual defeat, she became the foundation of the world humans would inhabit. Her body becoming sky and earth wasn't a punishment. It was a transformation, a continuation of her creative role, even in another form. Thinking about her this way helps us approach the myth with a quieter mind. We don't need to see her as a villain or a hero. We can simply see her as the ancient Mesopotamians saw her, a force older than the gods, a being older than creation, the one whose presence made everything possible. As we move forward through this story, through the birth of these early gods and their eventual conflicts, it helps to keep that sense of scale in mind. This isn't a story about individuals with personalities and choices, though those elements appear later. It's a story about forces, about the way early humans understood the world around them, about their attempt to describe the indescribable, and so, as the waters of the ancient beginning settle around us, we can drift deeper into the place where the first stirrings of creation began. The world hasn't taken shape yet, and the sky hasn't been lifted from the sea. Everything is still waiting. Everything is still forming. And Tiamat waits with it, patient and vast as the first murmurs of new existence begin to ripple through the deep. When you're ready, we can continue into the next part, letting the story move gradually from the stillness before the world toward the first signs that something within those waters was beginning to awaken. Before the first god stirred, before any shape had formed in the darkness, before light or sky or earth had anything resembling a name, there was a kind of heaviness across the earliest universe. Not a darkness you could see, not a silence you could hear, but something deeper. A quiet so complete that it almost felt alive. In that vast, formless expanse, nothing moved because nothing yet existed to move. Time had no meaning. Space had no boundaries. The universe was not a place, but more like a possibility waiting for the first nudge, the smallest disturbance, something that could wake it. And in that formless expanse lay the presence that ancient Mesopotamian storytellers would later describe as Tiamat, long before they imagined her as a being with scales or wings or the roar of storms. In the earliest imagining, she was simply the endless sea, not a place with waves and shores, but an ocean without edges, a body of water that wasn't made of drops or currents as we know them, but something more primordial, the raw material out of which everything else would one day be shaped. People often think of ancient stories as rigid, fixed things, but these early myths were more like living organisms changing each time they were spoken aloud. When storytellers described the beginning, they didn't picture mountains or stars or even the swirling colours of a nebula. They pictured water because water made sense. It was the most powerful thing they knew. It could cover everything they had built. It could rise without warning. It could drown fields in the spring and leave them fertile when it receded. To the earliest people, water was the closest thing to creation they ever witnessed with their own eyes. The rivers gave life. The marshes sheltered birds and fish, and the sea stretched so far across the horizon that it looked endless. So when they thought about what existed before the world began, they imagined something that felt like all of that combined into one immense, undivided presence. Tiamat, in this earlier sense, wasn't yet a figure or a personality. She didn't have thoughts or motives. She didn't create out of intention. She simply was. A vastness that existed before existence itself had any shape. She might have been imagined as salt water because salt water was strange and distant to people who lived far inland. The freshwater rivers were familiar, comforting, predictable, but the sea was something else. The sea was unpredictable, powerful, and impossible to control. It made sense for the earliest creators of myth to picture the world beginning in a place like that. A place that could hold both calm and danger, both life and destruction. Alongside Tiamat, or perhaps within her, there was another presence that would later be called Absu, associated with fresh water. The rivers that sustained life, the springs that emerged from the earth. When the earlier storytellers thought about creation, they imagined these two kinds of waters meeting, mingling, mixing, in ways that would eventually bring about something new. But it all began with that silent vastness, the stillness before the first movement. In many creation stories from around the world, there is a moment when something suddenly appears or a being awakens or a spark ignites. But in the Mesopotamian story, the beginning is slower. It feels more like a long exhale, more like the world gradually deciding it was time to start unfolding. The clay tablets that preserve this myth use language that is both simple and surprisingly precise. They describe a time when nothing had yet been named, when not even the gods existed. In their place were these two primordial waters mingling in the dark. It's interesting to imagine what this meant for the people who heard the story. Naming something was a powerful act. When you give something a name, you define it, shape it, give it boundaries. But in the beginning there were no boundaries, no sky, no earth, no creatures, no winds, no seasons. Just a drifting, mixing presence that was not yet aware of itself. To picture this beginning, imagine trying to recall a dream that fades even as you chase it. You know something was there, some shape or feeling, but the more closely you try to grasp it, the more quickly it slips away. The earlier storytellers weren't trying to describe the beginning in scientific terms. They were trying to capture an impression, a feeling, something like the sensation of standing at the edge of the sea at night with no moon in the sky and no lights on the shore. Just the dark water stretching into the unknown. That feeling is the closest thing they had to an understanding of what the world was before the world. We tend to think of myths as metaphorical, but for the people who told these stories, they weren't metaphors. They were explanations. The world was unpredictable. Floods could destroy crops. Storms could sweep across villages. The sea could swallow ships. Water had the power to give everything and to take everything away. It made sense that the beginning of the universe would come from a presence like that. Something that could hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. Tiamat, in this earliest imagining, was the dream before the dreamer, the material before the sculptor, the ocean before the world had rivers. She was the raw, unshaped potential of everything that would one day come to be. There was no intention in her existence, because there was nothing yet to intend. This is important to understand because later retellings of the myth turn Tiamat into a figure with anger, decisions, and conflicts. Those elements come much later, shaped by political changes, cultural shifts, and the needs of empires. But in this earliest phase, she is perfect stillness, perfect possibility. It's surprising how many cultures imagine something similar. The Greeks believed the world began with chaos, a shapeless void. The Egyptians imagined the primeval waters of Nun. The Hawaiians described a similar expanse. Even modern science, with all its equations and models, describes the earliest universe as something without structure, without form, without the distinctions we take for granted now. So the idea that the world began with something like a vast, unshaped presence isn't a strange one at all. It's a common thread running through human attempts to understand origins. As we move further into this early stage of the myth, it becomes clear that the ancient storytellers didn't think of Tiamat as a goddess in the modern sense. They didn't imagine her seated on a throne or ruling over anything. She didn't issue commands or engage in conversations. She was simply the environment in which everything else would happen. It is only later, once other beings begin to emerge, that her role becomes something more active. But here, before anything has taken shape, her presence is more like a background that fills every space, because there is no space yet to fill. Picture an artist staring at a blank canvas before the first brush stroke. The canvas already contains the potential for everything the painting could become. That's the closest comparison for Tiamat in this early moment. She's not yet the character that later stories depict, she is the backdrop of existence itself. The early storytellers didn't need to describe what she looked like because she didn't need a form. She didn't walk or speak or interact. She simply was, and that was enough. In the Enuma Elish, the story describes how from the mingling of these waters came the first stirrings of movement. Not dramatic movements, more like quiet shifts, ripples, something beginning to take shape in the dark. The earliest gods, entities like Lamu and Lahamu, are described as emerging from this mingling. They too were not yet fully formed beings, but more like the first expressions of change. They represented steps toward order, toward distinction, toward separation, but they were still part of the vast waters that birthed them. These early beings were not considered creators themselves. They were something like the first hints that creation was possible. Their existence marked a transition from pure stillness into something more dynamic. Later generations of gods would become more defined, more complex, more capable of interacting with the world. But here, in the beginning, they were closer to the water than to the sky. They had no temples, no worshippers, no stories of their own beyond the fact that they were the first things to form. It's interesting to imagine how the early listeners of this myth interpreted these moments. They might have heard the story while sitting near the river, with reeds rustling beside them and the sound of water moving through channels built by their ancestors. They would have felt intimately connected to the world described in the myth because water shaped everything around them. It provided food, transportation, and life. At the same time, it could lead to disaster. Entire cities were sometimes swallowed by floodwaters that rose faster than anyone expected. So the idea of a primordial ocean giving birth to the first gods was not something distant or abstract. It was as real to them as the sound of water flowing nearby. When the storytellers described this early stage, they weren't trying to create suspense or drama. They were laying the foundation for everything that would come later. The tension, the conflicts, the emergence of order. All of those developments only make sense if you understand that in the beginning, everything was undivided. Everything was one massive possibility. Tiamat and Absu weren't guardians or rulers. They were the raw elements of existence. And when the first gods began to form, they weren't intruders. They were the natural result of mixing, shifting, stirring. As more gods emerged from the waters, the stillness slowly began to break. These beings were still tied to the waters that birthed them, but they were different enough to begin changing the balance of things. Their presence created movement where there hadn't been any before, and with movement came the first hints of conflict, the first signs that the vast waters were beginning to wake. Understanding this stage helps explain what comes next. The story doesn't rush. It doesn't leap from creation to conflict without reason. The early storytellers were careful to show that the world didn't start with war or strife. It started with drifting, mixing, waiting. The universe had to dream first before it could wake. And in that dreaming, Tiamat existed without boundaries, without intent, without any need to resist or protect or react. Eventually, the changes happening within her waters would lead to transformations she did not expect and perhaps did not welcome. But those moments belong to later parts of the story. For now, we remain in that early expanse, where the waters still drift and the first shapes are only beginning to gather. There is no sky overhead yet, no earth beneath, just the presence of a being who does not yet know she will one day be called mother to gods, who will reshape her world. As the first movements ripple through the vastness, the story begins its gradual shift, following those early stirrings as they deepen and multiply. And through them, we begin to see how the stillness slowly gives way to the first signs of creation. Before anything had taken shape, before boundaries separated one thing from another, the universe still drifted inside that vast undivided sea. Nothing yet moved with purpose. Nothing breathed with hunger or ambition. There were no stars casting light, no shadows falling across surfaces, no surfaces at all. Only the great expanse of water that had existed long before existence had a name. Tiamat, still without form or personality in those earliest imaginings, remained the background of everything. The waters weren't turbulent or calm in any way we might recognize. They were simply present, the raw material of a universe that did not yet understand itself. The earliest storytellers must have wondered what it felt like when that stillness finally shifted. To them, creation was not a sudden event or a dramatic explosion. They imagined it beginning quietly, almost reluctantly, as if the world hesitated before taking its first breath. In their telling, the very first stirrings of creation were not the actions of conscious beings, but something more like a slow awakening, the gradual recognition that potential could become reality. They did not picture Tiamat as rising or moving or deciding. Instead, they imagined her waters beginning to gather, to thicken, to change in ways that were subtle at first, but unavoidable in their consequences. In the oldest written versions of the story, the moment when creation begins is described in simple terms. The mingling of the primordial waters produces something new. Not a being with thoughts or desires, but the earliest hint that the universe was no longer content to remain a single, unbroken mass. This shift is often overlooked because later parts of the myth are filled with dramatic confrontations and the rise of gods who shape the world into something recognisable. But without this first, delicate stirring, none of that would be possible. People who lived along the rivers must have recognised this kind of moment from their own environment. They saw life emerge from mud each spring. They watched reeds push up from the wetlands. They saw fish appear where there had been none the year before. To them, creation was not mysterious. It was familiar. Quiet changes in water signalled the beginning of seasons, the return of life, the arrival of new possibilities. So when they imagined the birth of the universe, they pictured something that felt like those early signs. A ripple, a stirring, a soft shift in the deep. In the story, the first beings to emerge from this mingling were not yet gods in the powerful sense. They were the earliest shapes, the first expressions of order beginning to push its way out of the vastness. Lahmu and Lahamu are the names given to these beings in later texts. The words themselves may once have meant something as simple as silt, or the ones covered in mud, which reflects how close these early figures were to their watery origins. Even before they gained personalities or roles, they were tied to the idea of formation, the slow transformation of formlessness into something that had identity. These early beings are not described in detail. There are no stories about their thoughts, their actions, or their interactions with one another, and that is fitting. At this early stage, creation was still too new to be expressed in familiar shapes. The first beings were more like suggestions than individuals, the earliest signs that the universe had begun to differentiate itself. Their appearance did not break the stillness entirely, but it signalled the beginning of something inevitable. Once change began, it would continue to unfold step by step, with each new being emerging from the one before it. It is tempting to imagine this moment as dramatic, but the myth itself suggests the opposite. Creation begins with softness, with small stirrings rather than loud declarations. The ancient storytellers seem to understand that the most powerful transformations often start quietly. The world does not leap into being, it grows into being. These early beings reflected the first sense of direction, the first moment when something could be described as taking shape. For the people who listen to this story, the idea that the universe began from water must have felt profoundly grounding. Water was not something distant or abstract. It was part of daily life. They saw water nourish fields, fill wells, and shape coastlines. They feared floods but depended on them. Their lives were built around the rhythm of rising and falling water, so the idea that the first beings rose from the same substance that surrounded them was a way of linking their world to the world of the gods. Creation was not separate from their experience. It echoed the natural patterns they saw all around them. As Lahmu and Lahamu emerged, they did not separate entirely from Tiamat. They remained within her, part of her, extensions of her nature. This connection is crucial to understanding the myth. Tiamat did not create the first beings in the way later gods would create. The early scribes did not describe her shaping them or forming them. Instead, they simply came from her, as naturally as thoughts from a dreaming mind. Their existence hinted that Tiamat contained more than the waters themselves. She contained the potential for form, for order, for movement, even if she did not yet express them intentionally. The story takes its time describing these early steps. There is no rush. Creation unfolds gradually, as if the universe were learning how to express itself. After Lahmu and Lahamu, another pair emerges, Anshar and Kishar, whose names may have meant something like the upper region and the lower region. This is the first sign of structure, the first sense of separation, The universe is beginning to sort itself into layers, to distinguish between above and below. These beings embody the idea that the world is moving from undivided unity into something more complex. They are the earliest indicators of a cosmos preparing to organize itself. The appearance of Anshar and Kisha represents a significant moment because it shows that creation is no longer random. The waters are now producing forms with direction. It is at this stage that the myth begins to transition from simple emergence to something closer to creation as we understand it. The early beings still have no personalities, but they represent principles. They represent the early cosmos finding its shape. For ancient listeners, this progression must have felt familiar. They knew what it meant to watch a landscape gradually transform. They saw rivers carve channels through the earth. They saw floodwater recede and leave behind new layers of soil. They saw families grow, settlements expand, and small structures eventually become cities. Their world did not change in sudden, dramatic ways. It changed through slow, persistent shifts. The myth mirrored that sense of gradual transformation. The universe did not appear fully formed. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, like a landscape shaped over time. As the story continues, Anshar and Kisha give rise to Anu, who would one day be recognized as one of the most powerful gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. But at this early point in the tale, he too emerges without fanfare. He's simply another step in the progression from simplicity to complexity. These early generations of gods are not yet involved in conflicts or decisions. They are part of the natural unfolding of existence. Each being marks another layer of differentiation, another sign that the primordial waters are beginning to express their full potential. In these early moments, the myth still treats creation as something almost passive. It is happening, not being caused. Tiamat remains at the center, not as an active creator but as the environment in which creation occurs. She does not intervene. She does not guide or resist. She simply surrounds and encompasses everything that comes into existence. The earliest gods are not yet aware of themselves as separate from her. They are simply parts of a process that has begun to move in a particular direction. It is only when more generations pass that the story shifts into something more dynamic. Once Anu gives rise to Ea, also known as Enki, a god associated with wisdom, intelligence, and the depths of the waters, the myth begins to transition from pure emergence into deliberate action. Ea is the first being who begins to show signs of personality, of choice, of behaviour. But even he is still bound to the waters, still emerging from the same deep place that birthed all the others. At this point in the story, Tiamat remains unchanged. She is still the infinite sea. She has not yet taken a shape or expressed an emotion. Her world has begun to fill with beings, yet she has not reacted. This calm is not indifference. It is simply the quiet before self-awareness. The myth describes a world that is shifting beneath her surface, preparing for conflict that she does not yet sense. For now, creation is still gentle. The early gods begin to grow in number. They begin to move. Their presence creates the first sense of disturbance within the deep. The tablets describe them as noisy, restless, filling the universe with activity that never existed before. These descriptions can easily be misunderstood. They do not imply childish misbehaviour or intentional disruption. They represent the unavoidable truth that once creation begins, it cannot remain silent. With form comes movement. With movement comes sound. The once still waters now pulse with the presence of beings who are beginning to discover themselves. For ancient listeners, this progression must have felt natural. They knew what it meant for quiet places to become lively. They watched children grow into adults. They saw quiet markets become bustling centres of trade. They observed how stillness gives way to activity, and how activity can bring both joy and tension. The myth reflects this understanding. Tiamat's silence is not permanent. It is simply the stage before recognition, before reaction, before the shift that will eventually reshape everything. For now, though, she remains in the deep, unknowingly surrounded by the earliest forms of creation. Her waters, once undisturbed, now carry the motions of the first gods. She is no longer alone, even if she has not yet noticed the significance of what is happening. The story will soon describe the moment when stillness gives way to awareness, when Tiamat's relationship to the beings within her changes. But at this stage, creation continues unfolding quietly. The first stirrings of creation mark the point where the myth begins to shift from passive emergence to something more dynamic. The waters are no longer dreaming alone. They are beginning to awaken, and within that awakening lies the first hint that the world will not remain peaceful forever. For now, though, we stay within the deep, where creation is still slow, still quiet, still more of a drifting than a struggle. The waters continue to change from within, unaware that these early movements will eventually lead to choices, conflicts, and transformations far beyond anything the first storytellers could fully describe. As creation continued its slow unfolding within the vastness, the presence that early storytellers called Absu remained as essential to the story as Tiamat herself. If Tiamat embodied the boundless saltwater sea, Absu represented the freshwater deep, the bubbling springs beneath the earth, the quiet reservoirs from which rivers flowed. These two primordial waters were not opposites. They were complements, shaping one another in ways that made creation possible. It is tempting to imagine them as figures standing beside one another, but that image belongs to a much later interpretation. In their earliest form, they were not people or creatures. They were conditions. They were states of existence. They were the first ingredients of the cosmos, blending and shifting in the dark long before the universe resembled anything familiar. The story does not describe a specific moment when Absu and Tiamat decided to shape the cosmos. There is no conversation, no plan, no deliberate act of creation. Instead, their mingling is described as something natural, something that had been happening for so long that no one could have recalled a time when it was not so. To the ancient storytellers, creation did not begin with intention. It began with coexistence. The sweet waters of Absu moved within the salty expanse of Tiamat, and from that movement came the earliest forms of life and order. The concept is simple, but its implications are enormous. Creation was not forced. It arose from contact. To the people who lived along the rivers of Mesopotamia, this idea was deeply familiar. Fresh water and salt water mixed constantly where the great rivers met the sea. They saw reeds, fish, and countless other forms of life thriving in those brackish places. They noticed how fertile the soil became where river water met land, creating conditions perfect for agriculture. They understood intuitively that life flourished where waters met, so the idea that the universe began in a similar mingling was not abstract. It was a reflection of their world. When Absu and Tiamat mingled, they did not do so with conflict or tension. At this early stage, the story is still peaceful. Everything is drifting, forming, expanding in ways that feel inevitable rather than coerced. Absu's waters were considered calm and nourishing, the kind of water that brings growth. Tiamat's waters were considered endless and powerful, capable of holding both creation and destruction. In combination, they produced something new, movement, form, the first signs that the universe had entered a phase where change would no longer be gentle but increasingly complex. As the early gods emerged within them, Absu and Tiamat began to occupy slightly different roles. Absu, associated with the clarity of springs and the purity of flowing water, became linked with stability and order. Tiamat, whose waters stretched into the unknown, became associated with possibility and boundlessness. But at this early moment, neither had intentions or personalities. They were the framework within which everything else developed. The clay tablets describe how the younger gods began to move restlessly through these primordial waters. Their presence marked the first time that sound entered the cosmic landscape. The early storytellers emphasized this shift. Before the younger gods, there had been no noise, no disturbance, no rhythms. With their arrival, the waters began to stir in ways that were unfamiliar. Absu, who had existed in perfect stillness for longer than anyone could imagine, began to feel that the world around him was changing in ways he could not control. Tiamat remained patient as the first murmurs spread through her vastness. But Absu's nature was different. He was the embodiment of calm, and the growing activity of the younger gods disrupted that calm. The tablets do not describe these early movements as malicious or intentional. The younger gods were not misbehaving or causing trouble. They were simply existing, discovering themselves and filling the universe with activity, because activity was the natural outcome of creation. But for Absu, whose identity was tied to stillness, these movements were unsettling. They signalled a transformation that he had not anticipated. The waters were no longer quiet. They pulsed, churned, vibrated with the presence of beings who were quickly becoming aware of their existence. For Tiamat, the change was less alarming at first. She had always been comfortable with vastness. She had existed long before creation began. The early disturbances were small compared to the immensity of her being. She felt them the way the sea feels raindrops, present, noticeable, but not disruptive to her nature. So as the early gods multiplied and grew, Tiamat allowed them to exist undisturbed within her. The story describes her as nurturing by simply remaining present. She did not create them deliberately, but she supported their existence by continuing to hold the space in which they developed. Absu, however, experienced the changes differently. To him, creation was becoming too loud. The younger gods filled the waters with motion and energy. They explored, they experimented, they discovered the boundaries of their abilities. And as they did, Absu felt his stillness slipping away. Later retellings would portray him as frustrated, irritated, or even angry. But these interpretations came centuries after the earliest versions. In the original story, his reaction is simply one of discomfort. He is a being of peace, and peace had become difficult to maintain. The myth describes a moment when Absu expresses his concern, though the details vary across the fragmented tablets. What matters is that he becomes aware of change in a way he had not been before. The quiet universe he had known was gone, replaced by a growing sense of motion that he felt powerless to influence. Tiamat heard his concerns, but the story makes it clear that she was not ready to act against the beings who had emerged from their union. To her, they were not a threat. They were the natural result of creation continuing to unfold. The shifting relationship between Absu and Tiamat during this stage mirrors the dynamic that exists in many creation stories around the world. The earliest forces that shape the universe often begin in harmony. As new forms emerge, the balance shifts. Some forces welcome the change, others resist it. This gives rise to tension that eventually leads to decisive actions. But at this stage, the myth has not yet reached a point of conflict. It is still describing the moment when the first awareness of imbalance appears. The younger gods continue to grow in number and in capability. They move through the waters not out of curiosity, but because movement was part of their nature. They represented order beginning to take shape. They embodied change in its first recognizable form. Their existence created ripples that spread outward across the primordial waters. These ripples were more than sound or motion. They were the first signs that the universe was shifting away from pure potential towards something structured. It is important to understand that the early story is not describing a fight between good and evil. That interpretation only developed much later. At this stage, the myth is describing the natural tension that arises whenever new forms of existence appear within an older environment. Creation brought change. Change brought movement. Movement brought disturbance. And disturbance brought awareness. These moments reflect the early human understanding of the world. They observed how new growth changed landscapes. They saw how animals shifted territories. They watched as settlements expanded into areas once quiet. Change was not negative, but it was inevitable. And the earlier storytellers wove that inevitability into their understanding of the cosmos. The younger gods did not intend to disrupt anything. They simply grew. And as they grew, they created patterns that had not existed before. Their presence marked the beginning of something larger than themselves. They were the first forces that would eventually shape the sky, the land, and the realms that future stories described in detail. But at this early stage, they were still children of the waters, moving within the depths without direction or purpose. Absu and Tiamat continued to encompass them. Absu felt increasingly uneasy, sensing that the waters were no longer his alone. Tiamat, on the other hand, remained steady, patient, watching the developments without passing judgment. This difference between them is one of the earliest signs that the story is preparing to shift into a new phase. Not yet a conflict, but the first hint of divergence. Two primordial beings encountering the consequences of creation in different ways. For the people who told and retold this story, the relationship between fresh and salt water was part of their daily lives. They understood the tension between river and sea. They saw how calm water could become turbulent when mixed with other currents. They knew that each type of water served a purpose, but they also knew that when the two met, neither remained unchanged. This natural observation became the foundation for their cosmic narrative. Absu and Tiamat shaped the young cosmos not by acting upon it, but by being the environment in which creation unfolded. As creation continued, the younger gods became more defined. Their movements became increasingly complex. Their presence reshaped the waters, creating currents where none had existed. These currents represent the earliest moments of order emerging within chaos. They mark the transition from potential to form. They show that the universe was beginning to express itself in ways that could not be reversed. Tiamat remained at the center of all of this. She held everything within her vastness, allowing creation to unfold naturally. Absu remained present as well, his waters flowing beneath and through the expanding cosmos. But their shared role was beginning to change. As the younger gods became more active, the balance between stillness and movement began to tilt, and with that tilt came the first hints of tension that would later reshape the myth into something more dramatic. This early period is crucial because it sets the stage for everything that follows. Without the mingling of Absu and Tiamat, there would be no cosmos. Without the early gods emerging from their waters, there would be no forces to shape the world. Without the gradual shift from stillness to movement, there would be no story at all. The earlier storytellers understood the importance of beginnings. They knew that creation could not happen without disruption, that change could not occur without altering the world that came before, and so, in the deep, the young cosmos continued to grow. Absu sensed the rising activity around him. Tiamat felt the currents swirling more strongly than before. The younger gods moved through the waters without understanding the impact of their presence. The universe was no longer silent, no longer still. Something new was taking shape, something that would eventually lead to choices, confrontations, and transformations none of the early beings could yet anticipate. But that belongs to a later moment in the story. For now, the waters continue to shift around Absu and Tiamat, and the young cosmos waits for what comes next. As the stillness of the early cosmos continued to shift, the mingling of Absu and Tiamat brought forth more than quiet ripples. What had begun as gentle disturbances within the deep now grew into something more purposeful, though not yet deliberate in the way later myths would describe. The early gods emerging from their waters were not born through intentional planning. They appeared because creation could no longer remain contained. The universe had crossed a threshold, and once that happened, the forming of new beings became as natural as the movement of water itself. The earliest pair, Lamu and Lahemu, were only the beginning. They represented the first small steps toward structure, the moment when the world stopped being a single undivided mass and started to gather shape and direction. But creation rarely stops after taking its first step. The universe seemed to sense its own potential, and from that potential more beings emerged. Ansha and Kesha followed, and with them came the first signs that the cosmos was beginning to separate itself into levels, above and below, higher and lower, Patterns were forming where before there had been only drifting. These early generations of gods were still connected entirely to the waters that birthed them. They had no temples, no followers, no stories of their own beyond the fact that they existed in the deep. Their identities were more like gestures toward the future rather than fully formed beings. But with each new emergence, the waters themselves changed. The presence of these new gods created more movement, more energy, more complexity. The stillness that had defined the beginning was now replaced by an environment where creation had become continuous. For the ancient storytellers, this unfolding mirrored the natural world they observed daily. They knew what it looked like when a river gave life to countless forms along its banks. They saw how fish, birds, plants, and insects all emerged from wetlands that seemed empty in one season and overflowing with life in the next. Their lands transformed constantly. Water shaped everything around them. It carved new channels, created new islands, and left behind fertile soil. The idea that the universe itself grew in a similar way was not only believable, it felt inevitable. In the myth, the emergence of Anshar and Kishar marks an important turning point. These beings were not merely products of the waters. They represented the first attempt by the universe to organize itself. They signaled the beginning of structure. After them came Anu, the sky god who would later be seen as one of the most powerful figures in the Mesopotamian pantheon. But at this early moment in the story, he too was simply another stage in the unfolding of creation. He had no elaborate mythology attached to him yet. He was part of the pattern forming in the deep. It is interesting to imagine how listeners thousands of years ago reacted to these descriptions. They would have recognized the idea of generations forming from earlier ones. They observed families growing. They watched children become adults. They saw how communities expanded as new members were born. The idea that the cosmos itself had a lineage made the universe feel familiar, almost relatable. Even though the gods were vast and powerful, their beginnings were described in terms that mirrored human experience. The waters that had once been perfectly still were now filled with beings who moved, grew, and existed in ways that Tiamat and Absu had never known before. The early gods did not yet create or destroy. They did not command or rule. They were simply present. Their existence alone represented change, and change, once it begins, rarely remains quiet. The story describes the younger gods becoming increasingly active. Their movements created currents where none had existed. Their presence produced sounds that had never been heard before. These were not loud crashes or violent storms. They were the sounds of life taking shape, of energy finding new channels, of creation realizing its own potential. But for Absu, accustomed to perfect stillness, these sounds were disruptive. He felt the deep waters vibrating with activity he had never experienced. The universe was no longer the quiet place it had always been. Tiamat, however, experienced these early changes differently. Her vastness allowed her to absorb the growing activity without feeling threatened. She had existed before creation, and in her quiet strength she continued to hold everything within her depths. The presence of the younger gods did not disturb her in the same way. She recognized their existence, even if she did not yet think of them as children. They were part of her, extensions of the universe she embodied. Their movements were simply new patterns forming within an ancient expanse. The myth does not describe Tiamat watching them closely or guiding them. At this stage, she remains passive, allowing existence to unfold naturally. The idea of a nurturing creator goddess did not come until much later. In the earliest versions, Tiamat was not a caretaker. She was the environment that allowed life to form. She was not motherly in the human sense. She was motherly in the cosmic sense, the way the earth is motherly to seeds, or the sea is motherly to creatures that hatch in its depths. Life arises because conditions allow it to, not because of intention. As these early generations of gods multiplied, they became increasingly distinct. Some became associated with certain regions of the forming cosmos. Others represented aspects of the world that would be important later. They were not yet individuals in the way modern myths often portray them, but they were no longer simple pieces of potential either. They were becoming something more complex, something that would eventually shape the fate of everything that came after. One of the most significant developments at this stage is the emergence of Ea, also known as Enki. He's not yet the wise and clever god celebrated in later stories, but even in these early stages he represents something new. He embodies intelligence, awareness, the ability to perceive the patterns forming around him. His emergence marks the moment when creation begins to move from instinct to insight. He is the first figure who seems capable of understanding the consequences of change. The presence of Ea brings a new dimension to the myth. With him, the story begins to move towards something more deliberate. The quiet unfolding of the universe begins to give way to actions that carry intent. Even though Ea has not yet taken any significant steps, his emergence signals the beginning of a shift. The universe is no longer purely reactive. It now contains beings capable of foresight. At this stage, the younger gods are described as restless. They move through the waters without stopping. They explore regions that had been untouched. They create patterns of motion that ripple across the cosmos. These movements, though natural and unplanned, create pressure within the deep. Absu, unable to accept the changes, experiences growing discomfort. He longs for the stillness that once defined his existence. To him, the younger gods represent disruption, even if they do not intend harm. Tiamat feels these changes too, but she interprets them differently. She remains calm. The myth describes her as patient, almost detached. She allows the younger gods to continue their activity because she recognizes that creation cannot remain silent. She does not see them as threats. She doesn't fear the future. She simply continues to hold everything within her immense presence. The contrast between Absu and Tiamat at this moment is subtle but important. Absu represents stability, stillness, the desire for a world that does not change. Tiamat represents potential, expansion, the acceptance of transformation. These differences are not moral or emotional, they are simply reflections of their nature, and as creation continues to unfold, these differences will become increasingly significant. The activity of the younger gods reaches a point where Absu can no longer ignore it. His waters are disturbed in ways he cannot soothe. The universe he once knew has transformed into something unfamiliar. He grows uneasy, not because of malice, but because he does not recognize the world emerging around him. His discomfort is the first sign that the cosmos is entering a new phase, one where the earliest forces must confront the consequences of creation. It is important to emphasize that the younger gods are not portrayed as rebellious. They are not acting out of defiance or ambition. They are simply fulfilling their nature. Their existence produces movement. Their movement produces change. This is the natural progression of creation. But natural progression often creates tension between old and new forces. That tension is not yet a conflict, but it is already shaping the direction of the story. As more gods emerge from the waters, their shapes become increasingly defined. The early generations were simple forms, more like impressions than individuals. But with each new being, the universe grows more structured. The myth describes these developments without rushing. It allows the story to breathe, to move at the pace of creation itself. Each generation represents a new layer of complexity, a new degree of separation from the undivided waters. These early gods, sometimes called the ancestors of the cosmos, are crucial even though their roles are not described in detail. They are the foundations upon which the later gods will build. They represent the first attempts by the universe to define itself, and though their actions are minimal, their existence alone marks a meaningful shift. Without them, the later conflicts that define the myth would have no context. Without them, the rise of figures like Ea and Marduk would make no sense. Without them, the story would have no depth. For the people who first told this myth, these early gods were the explanation for the complexity they saw in their world. They looked at the sky, the earth, the rivers, and the distant sea and saw a world full of layers. They saw a universe where nothing existed in isolation. Everything influenced everything else. The myth reflects that understanding. Each generation of gods represents a layer of creation. Together, they form the structure of the cosmos. As creation continues, the younger gods begin to interact in ways that create more motion. Their presence becomes increasingly difficult for Absu to tolerate. His nature is tied to stillness, and stillness is now impossible. He feels overwhelmed by a universe that refuses to return to the calm he once knew. Tiamat, though aware of the disturbances, remains patient. She does not wish to disrupt the beings who have emerged from her waters. To her, they are part of the natural expansion of existence. This divergence between Absu and Tiamat marks the beginning of a shift that will soon reshape the story entirely. The early generations of gods, unaware of the growing tension around them, continue to move through the waters, exploring, forming, and creating patterns that will one day lead to events far beyond anything they could imagine at this early stage. The cosmos, still young, is no longer the silent expanse it once was. It carries within it the presence of beings who represent the first steps toward order, and as their influence grows, the universe begins preparing itself for the moment when creation will collide with resistance, and the deep waters will no longer remain unchanged. For now, those changes continue quietly, forming the groundwork for everything yet to come. Creation had unfolded quietly within the deep for longer than the younger gods could measure. They had known no beginning, and they sensed no end. Their world was movement inside stillness, sound inside silence, and growth inside an environment that had once been peaceful beyond imagination. Absu and Tiamat had been the silent expanse that held everything together, and for a time that was enough. The young cosmos did not require boundaries or rules. It simply existed. But as the younger gods grew in number and strength, the nature of existence began to change. What had started as gentle currents in the primordial waters soon swelled into restless patterns that spread through the deep. These patterns were not harmful. They were the natural result of creation finding its rhythm. The younger gods were discovering themselves, and with that discovery came motion, energy, and the first signs of chaos. Not chaos in the destructive sense, but in the sense of life expanding faster than the environment around it could adapt. Absu, who embodied silence and clarity, felt these changes more sharply than anyone. His waters were no longer calm. They vibrated with movement, with sound, with activity that refused to stop. The younger gods churned through the deep like new stars beginning to pulse with their own internal fire. They were not trying to challenge him. They were not aware of his discomfort. They were simply being. That simple fact, however, was enough to create a fracture in the harmony that once existed between the primordial beings. Tiamat remained patient longer than Absu could. Her vastness had always absorbed everything without resistance. She had existed before time, before form, before the earliest stirrings of creation. The presence of the younger gods was noticeable to her, but not alarming. She had always been capable of holding contradictions. Activity did not disturb her in the same way that it disturbed Absu. But even she began to sense that the universe was shifting in a direction neither of them had anticipated. The clay tablets described this shift in simple language. The younger gods were noisy. They moved constantly. Their presence filled the deep with sounds and rhythms that had never existed before. Absu could feel their energy pressing against him. Tiamat could feel their motion echoing through her vastness. The waters that had once remained in perfect balance were now swirling with currents that grew stronger with each passing moment. These descriptions are not metaphors. They reflect the ancient understanding of how life changes landscapes. The early Mesopotamians saw how children brought liveliness into homes, how villages grew crowded as new generations were born, how rivers shifted when seasonal waters overflowed. They knew that growth brought both joy and disruption. The myth captures that reality through the behaviour of the young gods. Their existence was natural, but it came with consequences that Absu and Tiamat could no longer ignore. Absu reached a point where he could no longer endure the disturbances. His nature was tied to order, to quiet, to the calm that had existed when he and Tiamat were the only forces in the universe. The constant motion of the younger gods felt like an intrusion. He longed for the stillness that had defined the early cosmos. The myth describes him finally speaking his concerns, not out of anger, but out of deep discomfort. He was a being who had known one state for all of eternity, and now that state was slipping away. When Absu voiced his unease, the story makes it clear that Tiamat listened. She heard his worries, she understood his perspective, but she did not agree with his reaction. To her, the younger gods were not a threat. They were part of her. They had emerged from the waters that defined her existence. Their activity was an extension of her own potential. She did not see them as intruders or disruptions. She saw them as the natural next step of creation. Because of that, she was unwilling to support any drastic actions against them. This is the moment when harmony truly begins to fracture. Not because of a fight, but because two ancient beings who had always acted as one now saw the universe differently. Absu wanted a return to quiet. Tiamat accepted the growing noise. Absu longed for stillness. Tiamat embraced motion. The difference between them was simple, but it was enough to begin a divide that would eventually reshape the cosmos. The younger gods were unaware of this tension. They continued moving through the waters, creating patterns that reflected their expanding abilities. Ea, the god of wisdom, was among the first to sense that something had shifted, but even he did not understand the full extent of the change. The early cosmos was still too young, too fluid, for anyone to fully grasp the unfolding dynamics. And so the younger gods continued to behave as they always had, unaware that their existence had begun to pull at the edges of the primordial order. Absu's frustration deepened. The myth describes him considering a drastic solution, one that would restore the universe to the stillness he desired. He contemplated ending the existence of the younger gods, not because he hated them, not because he feared them, but because he could no longer endure a world that refused to match his nature. It is important to remember that this story does not frame Absu as a villain. He is not motivated by malice. He is a being of pure stillness faced with a cosmos that refuses to stay quiet. His decision, though extreme, is rooted in his identity. Tiamat, hearing Absu's intentions, reacted differently. She could not bring herself to support the destruction of the beings who had emerged from her waters. Her patience had its limits, but she still saw the younger gods as part of the natural unfolding of creation. She argued against Absu's idea. She urged caution. She reminded him that creation cannot be undone without consequences, and in this moment she became the first protector of the younger gods, not because she favoured them, but because she understood that the universe had already changed. There was no going back to the stillness of the beginning. The disagreement between Absu and Tiamat represents the first true division in the myth. It is not a fight. It is not a betrayal. It is simply two beings recognizing that they no longer share the same view of the unfolding cosmos. Their unity fractures, their harmony dissolves, and in the space left behind, unrest begins to form. Ea, sensing the growing tension, becomes the first of the younger gods to take action. He does not act out of rebellion or ambition, he acts out of fear. He knows that if Absu carries out his plan, the younger gods will be destroyed. The universe will revert to the silence that existed before creation. Ea cannot allow that to happen. He has seen the potential that creation holds. He values the complexity that has begun to emerge. He understands that motion, noise, and growth are not threats. They are the future. In a moment that marks the first deliberate act of defiance in the myth, Ea takes steps to protect himself and the other younger gods. He uses his growing intelligence to create a spell, one that would put Absu into a deep sleep. The myth does not describe this as an attack in the modern sense. It is more like a desperate attempt to prevent the destruction of creation. Ee's actions were guided by necessity. If Absu had been allowed to act on his impulse, the universe would have returned to stillness. All that had been created would be undone. The moment Ea casts his spell marks a profound shift in the story. For the first time, a god acts with intention. For the first time, an action carries consequences that ripple through the cosmos. When Absu falls into sleep, the deep waters that had once been held in perfect harmony finally lose their balance. The stillness that had defined the early cosmos disappears entirely. Power begins to concentrate in places where it had once been diffused. New relationships form. New tensions rise. Tiamat is devastated by Absu's downfall. She had disagreed with him, but she had not wanted him harmed. Her grief marks another turning point in the myth. The quiet patience she had carried for so long begins to fade. Her vast waters, once stable, begin to tremble. Not with rage, not yet, but with sorrow. She recognizes that the cosmos she had held together through her presence alone is now changing faster than she can absorb. The young gods, in defending their newfound existence, had altered the balance in ways she could not have anticipated. Ea, unable to undo the consequences of his actions, retreats into a place of safety within the deep. His choices had saved the younger gods, but they had also awakened something within Tiamat that would soon become a force of its own. The myth describes her grief slowly transforming into something sharper. She begins to feel pressure from all sides. Pressure from the younger gods who continue to multiply and move. Pressure from the memory of Absu's desire for stillness. Pressure from the universe itself, which no longer resembles the world she once held together with ease. The harmony that existed in the beginning is now gone. The deep is no longer united. A fracture has formed, one that cannot be easily healed. And in the growing tension, the first hints of divine turmoil begin to rise from the depths, not out of hatred, but out of change, not out of vengeance, but out of imbalance. The early cosmos, once silent and unified, now moves toward a moment where creation and conflict will become inseparable. The young gods continue to move through the waters, unaware that their existence has set forces in motion that will soon reshape everything they know. Ea watches from his place of refuge. Tiamat grieves in the vastness, and the universe prepares itself for the moment when sorrow transforms into something more powerful, and the deep begins to awaken in ways that will echo far beyond the first generations of gods. For now, though, the fracture lies quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the next shift. The deep did not change all at once. Even after Absu's fall, the waters did not erupt with immediate fury. Instead, the shift began in a way that ancient listeners might have recognized from their own world. Quietly at first, the way a storm gathers long before it breaks. The waters that had always drifted in calm, patient currents now carried a tension that had never existed in the early cosmos. Tiamat, once the embodiment of steady vastness, felt that tension settle through her entire being. For so long, she had allowed creation to unfold without resistance. She had been the environment in which life took its first shapes. She had held the younger gods in the same way the sea holds currents, letting them move where they wished without interference. But with Absu gone, something fundamental within her began to shift. The deep was no longer balanced. What had once been the union of two primordial forces was now a single presence carrying the weight of everything that existed. And that weight pressed against her in ways she had never known. The younger gods continued their restless movement through the waters, unaware of the growing heaviness around them. Their activity did not stop simply because the cosmos had changed. They still moved with energy and curiosity, filling the universe with patterns that reflected their growth. These patterns, subtle at first, became stronger as time passed. The deep vibrated with their presence, and the ripple of their actions spread outward, reaching places where silence had once been absolute. Tiamat felt every movement. She felt every sound. She felt the way the waters shifted around her as the younger gods expanded their influence. What had once been a soothing drift now felt more like a persistent disturbance, not because the younger gods meant harm, but because the loss of Absu had left her more exposed to the consequences of their existence. The balance that had once held the cosmos together was gone. She was no longer one part of a quiet unity. She was the sole remaining force of the old world, watching the new world grow in ways she could no longer ignore. Her grief did not fade quickly. It lingered, heavy and slow, seeping into areas of the deep that had never known sorrow. This grief was not personal in the human sense. She did not mourn Absu the way a mortal might mourn a loved one. She mourned the stillness that had defined the beginning of creation. She mourned the harmony that had existed before the younger gods transformed the cosmos. The grief was for a world that no longer existed, a world that had dissolved into 1,000 currents she could not control. As the younger gods continued to move, the distance between them and Tiamat widened. Not physically, but in terms of understanding. They had never known stillness. They had never experienced the universe the way Tiamat and Absu had. To them, movement was natural, sound was natural, growth was natural. The idea of returning to silence was unthinkable. Even Ea, wise as he was, could not fully grasp the scale of the shift. He had acted to protect creation, not to disrupt the balance of the cosmos. But the consequence of his action had been the loss of a primordial presence whose role had been more essential than any of the younger gods realized. The story describes how Tiamat's sorrow gradually deepened into something sharper. At first, it was simply awareness, a recognition that the cosmos she had carried for so long was no longer what it once had been. But awareness turned into pressure. Pressure turned into discomfort, and discomfort turned into a feeling she had never known before. It was not rage, not yet. It was a sense that creation had moved beyond her control, that the younger gods, without meaning to, had pushed the universe into a place she could no longer sustain through patience alone. The ancient storytellers would not have described this shift as sudden. They understood how emotion grows from experience. They saw how storms developed on the horizon long before the first drop of rain fell. They knew that even the strongest forces changed gradually. Tiamat's transformation reflected that understanding. She did not explode with anger. She did not lash out. Her awakening was slow, deliberate, heavy, like the deep waters drawing themselves closer around her. As she became increasingly aware of her changing place in the cosmos, Tiamat began to sense the full extent of Ea's actions. She realized that the younger gods were not merely energetic. They had taken a step that altered the very foundation of the universe. Absu had been more than her companion. He had been the counterbalance to her endless expanse. Without him, the deep waters now carried only her presence, her memories, her expectations. The younger gods had not only disturbed her, they had taken from her the stillness that had once defined creation. This realization stirred something within her that had never existed in the early cosmos. The myth describes her sorrow turning gradually into resentment. But even resentment is too simple a word. What she felt was closer to the deep tension that arises when something vast and ancient recognizes that the world around it has changed beyond recognition. Her waters, once calm, now carried currents of unease. Her stillness, once effortless, now felt forced. She could no longer ignore the younger gods, their movements, their noises, their expanding influence. She remembered Absu's warnings. He had spoken of their restlessness. He had feared their presence. At the time, she had dismissed his concerns. But now, with the cosmos unbalanced, his words echoed within her. She began to understand the discomfort he had felt. She began to recognize why he had longed for a return to quiet, and though she had not agreed with his drastic solution, she could no longer deny the truth behind his reaction. The younger gods had changed the universe, and they showed no signs of slowing. At this stage in the myth, The younger gods remain unaware of the magnitude of the situation. They continue to exist in ways that reflect their nature. Their energy spreads through the deep. Their movements create new patterns. Their presence becomes more prominent with each passing moment. They are not trying to challenge Tiamat. They do not see themselves as threats. They are simply growing, as life always does, without knowing that their growth is slowly pushing the cosmos toward conflict. As Tiamat's resentment deepened, the story describes how she became increasingly aware of the imbalance that now defined the universe. Her grief had once been passive. Now it began to transform into something active. She felt the absence of Absu not only as loss, but as a void that demanded to be filled. Her waters had always been vast enough to hold everything, but now they were carrying the weight of a cosmos that no longer aligned with her nature. That pressure pushed her toward a decision she had never expected to make. The myth introduces a new element at this stage: consultation. Tiamat did not act immediately. She turned to the beings who remained loyal to her, ancient creatures who had existed within her waters long before the younger gods appeared. These were not the structured deities that would come later. They were older, rawer, more instinctual beings, forces that mirrored the earliest days of creation. To them, Tiamat was not only the environment, she was the essence of existence itself. And when she began to stir with something resembling anger, they stirred with her. Their presence gave shape to Tiamat's rising agitation. She had always been capable of absorbing everything within her, but now that ability seemed less like strength and more like burden. The deep waters trembled with her growing awareness. What she felt was not the sudden flare of rage, but a slow, heavy recognition that the younger gods had taken something from her she could never retrieve. Absu's fall had left her exposed, vulnerable, isolated, and the younger gods, unaware, continued to press outward, creating more movement, more sound, more disturbance. The pressure built. Not in the explosive sense that modern stories tend to portray, but in the way that deep waters accumulate tension over time. A quiet tightening, a slow gathering, a shift in the weight of the cosmos. The myth describes Tiamat's growing awareness in terms that reflect inevitability. The universe had changed. She would change with it. Her patience, once infinite, now thinned. Her sorrow, once quiet, now sharpened. Her presence, once the steady foundation of existence, now trembled with the first signs of awakened power. The ancient storytellers understood what it meant for something vast to awaken. They saw how storms built themselves from warm winds and rising moisture. They watched how floods swelled from gentle rains. They knew that natural forces did not remain calm forever. That understanding shaped their depiction of Tiamat. She did not become wrathful because of spite. She became wrathful because creation had grown beyond the boundaries of her ability to hold it quietly. Her nature, once patient, now responded to the imbalance that had been forced upon her. As the tension deepened, the myth describes how Tiamat finally reached a threshold. She could no longer remain still. Her waters surged in ways they never had. The deep that had once embraced creation now carried the signs of a storm building from within. The ancient beings who surrounded her recognized the shift. They began to move with her, responding instinctively to the change in her presence. And the younger gods, though still unaware, felt subtle changes in the waters around them. The deep became heavier. The currents grew stronger. The stillness that once anchored the cosmos had vanished entirely. Tiamat, for the first time, turned her attention fully toward the younger gods, not with affection, not with neutrality, but with a clear recognition that they had disrupted the world she had carried since the beginning. And that recognition, heavy and ancient, began to crystallize into something that would soon drive the story into its most dramatic phase. Her wrath did not erupt in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, gathering force with the weight of aeons behind it. The deep waters darkened, not in colour, but in presence. The ancient beings stirred. The cosmos felt the shift. and the universe braced itself for the moment when her anger, fully awakened, would transform creation in ways nothing could reverse. For now, though, the storm continues to gather beneath the surface, gaining weight, gaining shape, preparing to reveal a side of Tiamat that the cosmos had never known. As Tiamat's unease gathered weight in the deep, the younger gods continued to exist in a world they barely understood. Their earliest generations had emerged without guidance. Their awareness was simple, their instincts raw, their movements shaped by the natural forces that surrounded them. But each new generation brought a level of refinement that had not existed before, and with that refinement came traits that had the potential to influence the future of the cosmos in ways the primordial waters could never have predicted. The gradual rise of tension did not halt creation. If anything, the pressure in the deep seemed to accelerate the formation of new gods. They emerged from the mingling waters just as their predecessors had, but each appeared with more defined traits, sharper abilities, and a growing sense of identity. They were not yet separated into the structured pantheons that later civilizations would worship, but they were no longer indistinct expressions of possibility either. They had voices, roles, and a growing awareness of their place in an expanding cosmos. Among these later generations, one figure would eventually stand apart, a being whose emergence would signal a dramatic shift in the myth. His name would be Marduk, though at this early stage he was only another presence rising within the waters. His significance was not immediately apparent. Even the older gods didn't recognize the full potential carried in his being, but creation had begun shaping itself with increasing purpose. It was no longer producing gods at random. The cosmos itself seemed to be preparing for the conflict that was beginning to take form, and Marduk appeared as part of that preparation. Before Marduk's presence could influence the story, the turmoil created by Absu's fall needed to reach its next stage. Tiamat's grief had deepened into resentment. Resentment had thickened into agitation, and agitation had begun its slow transformation into something far more potent. Yet she had not acted. The waters had grown darker, heavier, and more charged with energy, but no force had yet emerged from her to match the scale of her awakening. The younger gods felt the tension even if they did not understand it, and Ea, whose actions had set this shift in motion, watched with growing unease as the cosmos responded to the consequences of his choices. Ea, though intelligent and perceptive, was still not the ruler of anything. His wisdom did not grant him control over the unfolding events. He understood the danger, but he had no authority to command the cosmos, no ability to soothe the vast presence now stirring in the deep. His earlier victory over Absu had been born out of necessity, not ambition. But that victory had created a void, and voids in myth rarely remain empty. Something would fill it. Something always fills it. The younger gods sensed the instability growing around them, and many withdrew into safer regions of the deep. Creation had taught them motion, awareness, and the first traces of fear. They began to watch one another more closely. They felt the shifting patterns in Tiamat's presence. They saw the ancient beings that surrounded her begin to move with new purpose. The cosmos no longer felt like a place of simple possibility. It felt like a landscape being pulled toward conflict. It was in this environment that Marduk's emergence began to matter. His birth was not an isolated event. It came at a time when creation was producing gods with increasing strength, complexity, and clarity. But even among these new beings, he was different. His appearance represented a level of potential that none of the earlier gods had carried. The myth describes him as powerful from the moment he appeared, not because he trained or learned, but because the cosmos itself had shaped him with qualities suited for what was to come. He did not emerge into a peaceful universe. He emerged into one bracing for a confrontation between forces too vast for the earlier gods to navigate. His presence was not yet a solution, but it was a sign that the universe was preparing to defend the patterns of creation that had taken root. Even though he was young, the other gods felt something in him that had never existed before. He radiated strength. He carried abilities that set him apart. But at this early moment, he did not wield those abilities. He was simply a presence that drew attention. Ea recognized Marduk's significance before anyone else fully understood it. He sensed the power within him, the potential that could shift the direction of the cosmos. But Ea also recognized that such potential came with responsibility. Marduk would not remain an observer for long. The conflict brewing in the deep would soon require action, and if any of the younger gods were capable of facing Tiamat's awakening presence, it would be him. But Marduk was not merely powerful, he was also adaptable. He learned quickly. He understood the environment around him in ways that earlier gods could not. The deep responded to him differently. The waters seemed to bend around him. He moved through the cosmos with a confidence that belied his youth, and while his early movements were simple explorations, they hinted at the potential for something far greater. The older gods, still uncertain, watched him quietly. They sensed that his presence would soon matter, even if they did not yet understand how. They felt that the cosmos was shifting around him, as if creation itself had chosen him to carry the future. But the growing turmoil made it difficult for them to focus on him entirely. Tiamat's agitation continued to swell. Her waters pulsed with a heaviness that spread through every corner of the deep. The younger gods, though powerful, were not prepared for the scale of force that her awakening would release. As her presence grew more volatile, Tiamat began to gather beings around her. These were not the structured gods of later myth. They were ancient entities born from the earliest phases of creation, raw forces that mirrored chaos rather than order. They were creatures of the deep, formed from the turbulence of her rising emotion. Some were described as serpents, others as monstrous shapes representing storms, venom, and primordial landscapes. Their forms were not stable. They shifted, expanded, contracted, and pulsed with her growing power. Tiamat did not create them with intent. They emerged from her the same way the early gods had emerged, naturally, inevitably. But their appearance reflected the state of her being. They were not born from potential. They were born from agitation. Their presence marked the point where Tiamat's turmoil began to manifest into tangible forces. The young cosmos, once filled with simple movement, now carried beings whose existence represented the first signs of conflict taking visible form. The younger gods began to fear these entities. They had never encountered anything like them. They did not understand their purpose. They sensed danger, not in the simple way that earlier generations had felt discomfort, but in a profound way that signaled the possibility of annihilation. The early gods had emerged into a world of possibility. These new beings emerged into a world preparing for confrontation. Ea, understanding the gravity of the situation, recognized that he could not confront Tiamat alone. He had acted once against Absu, but that action had come before the deep had filled with forces far greater than those he had once faced. Tiamat was not merely disturbed. She was awakening into something unrestrained, something capable of reshaping the entire cosmos. Ea knew that the younger gods were not strong enough to withstand her fully awakened power. He knew that the creatures gathering around her would overwhelm them, and he knew that unless a new force rose among them, creation would collapse back into the chaos from which it had emerged. This is the moment when Marduk's role begins to shift from potential to purpose. He sensed the fear of the younger gods. He saw the shadows spreading across the deep. He felt the power rising within Tiamat's presence. And he understood that the cosmos was moving toward a confrontation that could not be avoided. Unlike the others, he did not shrink from the threat. Even in youth, he carried a clarity that set him apart. He stepped forward, not because he sought dominance, but because he understood that the universe was approaching a moment that demanded strength, unlike anything that had come before. But strength alone would not be enough. The myth describes how the younger gods began to seek ways to protect themselves. They gathered, discussed, debated, and eventually turned to Marduk with a mixture of hope and desperation. They recognized that he possessed abilities they lacked. He carried a presence that calmed them, even as the cosmos trembled around them. They asked if he could face Tiamat. They asked if he would fight for the continuation of creation. Marduk did not answer immediately. He understood the weight of their request. He knew that facing Tiamat meant confronting the very force that had birthed the cosmos. He knew that her power was ancient, boundless, and capable of overturning everything that had been formed. But he also recognized that the younger gods could not survive without intervention, and so he made a decision that marked the beginning of his ascent. He agreed to face Tiamat, but he asked for something in return. Not praise, not status, not worship. He asked for authority. He asked for the right to act on behalf of creation. He understood that he could not fight a force as vast as Tiamat without the unity of the younger gods behind him. He needed their trust, their support, their willingness to recognize him as their champion, and they, driven by fear and hope, agreed. This agreement marked the first moment when the younger gods formed a unified front. They had existed together, but they had never acted together. They were beings of instinct, not strategy. But Marduk's presence changed that. His willingness to face Tiamat gave them direction. His strength gave them confidence. His clarity gave them purpose. And so, with the support of the younger gods, Marduk began to prepare. The myth describes him receiving weapons unlike anything the cosmos had ever seen. They were not forged from metal or fire. They were formed from the natural forces that surrounded him. Winds that had once drifted aimlessly now gathered around him as allies. Storms bent toward him with recognition. Light responded to him. Shadows obeyed him. The cosmos itself seemed to offer him the tools he needed. Ea granted him knowledge. The older gods granted him blessings. The forces of nature granted him power, and the younger gods granted him authority. Marduk did not seek these things. They came to him because the cosmos recognized that the moment had arrived when creation needed a protector. The universe had given rise to Tiamat's unrest. It had given rise to the younger god's fear, and now it had given rise to a being capable of confronting both. As Marduk armed himself with winds, storms, and forces that answered his call, the cosmos felt the shift. Not a shift toward victory or defeat, but a shift toward inevitability. Tiamat's awakening had created a wave of turmoil that threatened to erase creation. Marduk's rise created a counterforce that would soon meet that turmoil head-on. The deep braced itself. The younger gods watched, and the cosmos prepared for a confrontation that would shape everything that followed. For now, though, the rising storm continues to gather its strength, and Marduk's ascent continues as the forces of creation align behind him. The growing tension within the deep had reached a point where it could no longer remain contained. Creation had expanded too far, and the forces that had once existed quietly beside one another now stood on opposite sides of a divide that neither could cross without altering the cosmos forever. On one side was Tiamat, awakened into a form of power she had never needed to use before. On the other were the younger gods, unsettled and fearful, their future resting on forces they did not fully understand. And in the centre of this shifting universe stood Marduk, young yet unmistakably chosen by circumstance to face a being who had shaped the world long before his existence. The deep had not known conflict before this moment. It had known change, disturbance, and growth, but it had never known the deliberate clash of power. Conflict was not a concept that existed in the earliest cosmos. The first gods had emerged naturally, their roles defined by the rhythms of creation, not by opposition. But with Absu's fall and Tiamat's awakening, the universe had entered a new phase, one in which intention mattered, in which choices held the potential to shape everything that followed. Tiamat did not seek battle because she enjoyed destruction, or because she longed for dominance. She acted because the world had shifted beyond her ability to accept it. She could not return to the stillness that had defined the beginning, and she could not accept the chaotic expansion of the younger gods. Her unrest had grown into something that demanded expression. The monstrous beings that had gathered around her were not soldiers in the human sense. They were manifestations of her agitation, extensions of the emotions she had never known until the balance of the cosmos was broken. Marduk, meanwhile, did not rise out of ambition. He rose because the younger gods recognized that no one else possessed the strength necessary to face the storm forming within the deep. His presence offered clarity at a moment when fear threatened to overwhelm the newer generations. He did not claim leadership. He accepted it because the universe had left him no alternative. His power did not come from a desire to rule. It came from the fact that creation itself was shifting, and he was the shape that shift had taken. The preparations for the coming confrontation unfolded quietly. Marduk gathered the forces that had chosen to support him. Winds moved at his command, bending around him as if drawn to his presence. Storms answered him without being summoned. Light sharpened in his hands. He carried with him not weapons crafted by gods, but forces drawn from the very nature of the cosmos. The younger gods watched as these forces gathered around him, sensing that the universe was aligning itself toward a moment that would determine its future. Tiamat, too, prepared in her own way. Her waters grew heavier, thicker, filled with the presence of the beings that had emerged from her agitation. These creatures were described in the tablets with a sense of awe, not because they resembled known animals, but because they were expressions of primordial chaos taking visible form. Some carried the ferocity of storms, others carried the unpredictability of venomous creatures. All of them reflected Tiamat's internal transformation. She was no longer simply the vast sea that had nurtured creation. She was the force of imbalance made manifest, ready to confront the gods who had disrupted the world she had once held together effortlessly. The stage for the conflict was not a battlefield in the human sense. There was no land, no sky, no horizon. The clash would take place in the deep itself, in the endless waters where creation had unfolded from the beginning. This setting carried its own significance. The battle would not be fought on new ground. It would be fought in the place that had once held perfect harmony, now fractured by grief and unrest. The ancient listeners would have understood this deeply. In their world, water was both origin and threat. It could give life, but it could also swallow entire cities. The idea that the deepest conflict of the cosmos would occur within those same waters reflected their understanding of how creation and destruction were intertwined. As the moment drew closer, the younger gods grew increasingly anxious. Their fear was not shameful. It was reasonable. They had never faced anything like Tiamat's awakening presence. They felt her agitation spreading through the deep, a pressure that tightened around them with every passing moment. Even Ea, who had once acted decisively, felt the weight of what was coming. His wisdom did not offer him comfort now. He had set this chain of events in motion, but he could not predict how it would unfold. The only certainty was that the universe would not remain the same. When Marduk stepped forward, the deep reacted to him in a way that felt different from anything the younger gods had ever witnessed. The waters parted slightly around him, not with fear, but with recognition. The forces of creation were aligning themselves around his presence. He moved toward the regions of the cosmos where Tiamat had gathered her strength, not with arrogance, but with a quiet sense of purpose. He understood that the coming confrontation was not a contest for power. It was a necessary step in the survival of the cosmos. The myth describes the moment when Marduk finally confronted Tiamat in terms that carry an immense weight. Not because of dramatic speeches or sudden strikes, but because the very act of facing her represented a shift in the structure of the universe. For the first time, creation was meeting chaos directly, not as forces drifting side by side, but as entities aware of their roles. Tiamat, vast and ancient, faced a god who had never known a world without motion. Marduk, young and powerful, faced the being who had allowed creation to unfold from the beginning. The deep did not fall silent. Instead, it seemed to gather its breath. The tides pressed outward. The currents surged. The monstrous beings surrounding Tiamat moved restlessly, reflecting the turmoil within her. Marduk's winds tightened around him, forming a barrier that shielded him from the oppressive weight of her presence. The cosmos held its tension in a way that mirrored the quiet before a storm breaks open. The first clash between them was not physical. It was a meeting of forces. Tiamat's presence surged outward in a wave that carried the weight of primordial chaos. Marduk responded with a force of wind so strong that it cut through the deep, creating pockets of space where no water touched him. The two forces pushed against one another, neither overpowering the other in that initial moment. The deep trembled as their energies collided, sending vibrations through the earliest layers of the cosmos. This was the moment when the myth became something greater than a story. It became an explanation for the structure of the universe itself. Ancient listeners did not interpret the battle as a simple conflict between rival beings. They understood it as the moment when order and chaos defined their relationship, when the forces of creation proved they could stand against the forces of unmaking, when the cosmos declared that it would not return to silence without resistance. Tiamat's power surged again, stronger this time. Her waters rose around her like walls of pressure, carrying the raw force of unbounded potential. Her creatures attacked with a fury that reflected her unrest. They moved with unpredictable patterns, lunging toward Marduk with shapes that shifted and twisted in the deep. Their presence alone would have overwhelmed any of the younger gods. But Marduk did not retreat. He moved through the deep with a fluidity that matched the motion of the waters themselves. He called on the winds again, directing them with precision. The forces that surrounded him became sharper, more focused. They sliced through the currents, dispersing the creatures that rushed toward him. Each movement he made created new space within the deep, space that pushed back against the suffocating presence of chaos. And with each step, the younger gods watching from afar felt a spark of hope. They had feared Tiamat's awakening, but in Marduk they saw something they had not expected, a being capable of meeting her power without being consumed by it. But Tiamat was far from defeated. Her strength came from the foundations of creation itself. She moved with the weight of the earliest universe behind her. Her waters churned with fury and her presence expanded outward with each wave of agitation. When she finally confronted Marduk directly, her power filled the deep to its farthest reaches. The cosmos shook with her force. The younger gods felt her presence press against them, even from the distant regions where they watched. Marduk faced her with a clarity that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. He did not strike blindly. He did not act out of anger. He acted out of necessity. He called upon the winds to surround him entirely, forming a maelstrom that lifted him above the swirling waves of Tiamat's rage. The deep roared around him, responding to the clash of forces that had never existed before. Light flashed around him, drawn from the earlier sparks of creation, illuminating the dark waters with a brilliance that had never been seen. The moment of decisive action is described with remarkable simplicity in the tablets. Marduk, supported by the winds and armed with the forces that creation had lined behind him, struck at Tiamat. He did not strike at her body alone. He struck at the force she had become, the chaos that threatened to undo everything the younger gods had built. His attack was not driven by hatred. It was driven by the need to preserve the world that had emerged from her waters. When Marduk's strike connected, the deep shook so violently that the cosmos seemed to split open. The waters parted, the currents reversed. Light burst through places that had never known illumination. In that moment, Tiamat's strength faltered. Not completely, but enough for Marduk to press forward. The forces of creation and chaos collided in a way that reshaped the structure of the universe. The deep had never known such pressure. The younger gods, watching in awe and fear, felt their entire existence hinge on the outcome. Tiamat fought with the full force of her being. She lashed out with waves that carried the strength of the earliest cosmos. Her creatures surged toward Marduk, their forms contorting in response to her agitation. But Marduk did not retreat. He pressed forward with every force at his command. The winds sharpened into storms, the storms sharpened into blades. The deep responded to him in ways that reflected the shift occurring at the core of creation. The clash reached its peak when Marduk unleashed the force that would ultimately define the myth. He captured the winds in a way that no other god had ever done, directing them with such precision that they expanded Tiamat's vast form, leaving her exposed for the first time, and in that moment he struck with a force that carried the weight of all creation behind it. The deep trembled, the cosmos shifted, and the battle that had split the heavens reached its turning point. Tiamat's power did not vanish in an instant. It drained slowly, like the ebbing of an immense tide. The universe, still vibrating from the clash, began to settle into new patterns. The younger gods felt the pressure around them lift slightly, not fully, but enough to sense that the tide was turning. Marduk stood amid the deep, surrounded by the remnants of the storm, his presence steady even as the cosmos continued to tremble. The battle was not over, but the moment had arrived when creation proved it could withstand the force of chaos. And as the waters began to shift around him, the cosmos prepared itself for the transformation that would follow once the echoes of the battle settled through the deep. When the pressure of the great clash finally began to ease, the deep did not return to silence. The echoes of what had happened continued to move through the cosmos like aftershocks, rippling outward from the place where Tiamat and Marduk had met in force. Nothing in the universe had experienced an event like that before. Creation had been shaped by drifting, mingling, emergence, and gradual expansion. Now it had been shaped by impact, and the world that followed could not resemble the one that existed before. Tiamat's strength, vast and ancient, had defined the earliest cosmos. Even in her unrest, even as she rose against the younger gods, her presence had remained the foundation of existence. When her power finally broke beneath the pressure of Marduk's force, her body did not disappear into nothingness. The myth does not describe her vanishing, dissolving, or fading. Instead, it describes something much more meaningful. Her form remained, her presence remained. But now it was no longer the source of chaos. It was the material from which the world itself would be shaped. The younger gods, watching from afar, felt the shift before they understood it. The tension that had threatened to tear creation apart receded slowly, revealing a calm that did not feel like the old stillness. It felt new, purposeful, and waiting. The deep's waters no longer vibrated with the same level of fear. There was still weight, but it carried a different meaning, like the weight of soil that will soon give rise to growth. Marduk stood in the vastness, surrounded by the remnants of winds and storms that had answered his commands. The forces that had gathered around him did not leave immediately. They lingered, sensing that their role in the cosmos was not yet complete. The universe itself seemed to recognize that a new phase of creation was beginning, one that would rely not on the quiet drift of the early waters, but on intentional shaping. Tiamat's great body lay across the deep, massive, beyond comprehension. Her presence filled the cosmos from one end to the other. She had once been the environment that contained all existence. Now she was material. The myth describes this moment with a weight that early listeners would have understood immediately. When something ancient and powerful transforms, its remnants do not vanish. They become the foundation for what follows. Marduk approached her vast form not with triumph, but with purpose. The story does not portray him as celebrating or boasting. He's not shown as gloating over a defeated opponent. Instead, he moves with a sense of responsibility. The universe had shifted because he acted, and now the future depended on what he did next. His role was no longer simply to defend creation, it was to build it. The younger gods gathered around him cautiously. They were unsure of what would happen next. They had never seen the cosmos in such a state. They had never witnessed the transformation of a primordial being into the material of creation. They waited, sensing that the shape of the future would emerge from Marduk's next decisions. The myth describes how Marduk examined Tiamat's vast form with a sense of understanding that none of the younger gods possessed. He recognized that her body held the potential to form the very structure of the cosmos. He recognized that her presence could become the foundation of a world more stable than anything that had existed before. Her waters had once nurtured life. Now her form would become life's environment. He began by dividing her enormous body into two halves. This act is described simply in the tablets, yet it represents one of the most profound moments in the myth. The splitting of Tiamat is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of transformation. Her being, once undivided and infinite, becomes the source of duality in the cosmos. Her two halves become two realms, each essential to the structure of the world that would follow. From one half, Marduk created the sky. He lifted it upward, stretching it across the cosmos to form a wide expanse that would separate the waters above from the waters below. The sky did not exist before this moment. There had been no barrier, no dome, no boundary. Now, because of Tiamat's transformation, the cosmos gained height, it gained direction. It gained a sense of above and below that would shape everything to come. The younger gods watched as Marduk fashioned the sky. They saw how he anchored it in place, stretching it so far that it formed the dome that would later hold stars, clouds, winds, and the pathways of the heavens. What had once been Tiamat's upper body now became a realm that would shape the movements of future deities, celestial cycles, and the rhythms of time. From her other half, Marduk created the earth. He pressed it downward, spreading it across the deep to form a solid foundation. Before this moment, there had been no land, no surface, nothing on which beings could stand. The cosmos had been only water, drifting forms and shifting currents. Now, because of Tiamat's body, there was structure, there was ground, there was solidity. The ancient listeners would have recognized the significance of this moment immediately. They lived in a world where land was precious. They understood how rivers carved valleys and how earth shaped their daily existence. The idea that the land itself came from the body of the primordial sea made perfect sense. It reflected their understanding that life emerged from water but depended on land to thrive. Marduk continued shaping her form with deliberate care. He created mountains from the rises of her body. He formed valleys from the lower parts. He fashioned rivers from the pathways where her veins had once carried the essence of creation. Every part of the world they knew, every hill, every stream, every ridge, came from her transformed being. Tiamat did not vanish in defeat. She became the landscape on which the future would be written. Even the heavens gained new structure because of her. Marduk placed lights in the sky, some that moved across it and others that remained fixed. He arranged them in patterns that would guide the younger gods and eventually guide humans. These lights marked the passage of time. They created the seasons. They established the order that would allow life to understand its own rhythms. The myth describes how Marduk placed the moon in the sky and assigned it specific phases. He placed the sun and gave it a path that would determine the length of days. He arranged the stars in constellations, positioning them as markers in the heavens. These actions transformed the cosmos from a place of drifting existence into a place governed by cycles, patterns, and predictability. Tiamat's body did not resist these transformations. She'd already completed her journey as the primordial environment of creation. Her presence now became the structure that made ordered existence possible. This transformation was not a loss. It was a continuation of her role in shaping the universe, even if her form no longer moved with the same vastness as before. The younger gods observed each step with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. They had never seen the cosmos shaped by deliberate action. They had emerged from the waters without planning or intention. Now they watched as the universe took on form because a single being guided it. Marduk's decisions carried consequences that would extend far beyond his own lifetime. They would determine the shape of everything that followed: land, sky, seasons, and the very structure of time. Ea, watching quietly, recognized the magnitude of what Marduk had done. He understood that the universe had transitioned from a place of drifting creation to a place shaped by purpose. The younger gods would now live in a world built by design rather than accident, and that world would depend on the stability created from Tiamat's transformation. As Marduk continued shaping the cosmos, the younger gods began to gain roles within the new structure. Some were assigned to watch the heavens, others became guardians of regions, others were given responsibilities tied to the cycles Marduk had established. Creation had become organized. The universe now required caretakers, and the younger gods, once restless and uncertain, gained purpose for the first time. Tiamat's monstrous creatures did not disappear. Some were destroyed in the battle, others were bound, repurposed, or placed in roles that reflected their nature. They became guardians of thresholds, symbols of boundaries, or forces held in check by the order Marduk had established. In this way, even Tiamat's unrest became part of the new cosmos, not erased, but integrated. The deep itself changed. It was no longer the single realm that had defined the earliest universe. With Tiamat's body forming the structure of the world, the deep became a place beneath the earth, a region of its own. The cosmos gained layers: heaven above, earth in the middle, and waters below. This structure would shape countless myths across cultures, but here it began with the transformation of Tiamat's form. As the universe settled into its new shape, the younger gods felt something they had never experienced before: stability. The drifting uncertainty of the early cosmos was gone. The patterns Marduk created gave meaning to the passage of time. The world no longer drifted through endless potential. It moved through cycles that could be understood, predicted, and followed. For ancient listeners, this part of the myth explained the world around them more clearly than any scientific explanation could. The sky followed patterns because a god placed lights there. The earth existed because it had been shaped from the body of the primordial sea. Mountains existed because they had once been the ridges of an ancient being. Rivers flowed because they followed the pathways of her form. Everything around them carried meaning rooted in the myth's earliest moments. Marduk's work was far from finished, but his transformation of Tiamat's body marked the moment when the cosmos shifted from potential to reality. Creation was no longer a drifting process. It had become structured, intentional, and anchored. The universe that had once been held quietly by Tiamat's presence was now shaped by her transformed being. And as the younger gods began to move through this new world, finding their roles within it, the cosmos prepared itself for the next stage, one in which memory, power, and the legacy of Tiamat's transformation would continue to shape everything that followed. Once the world had settled into the structure shaped from Tiamat's vast form, creation no longer drifted through endless potential. The new cosmos carried patterns, cycles, seasons, and a sense of stability that had never existed before. Mountains rose where her body had been pushed upward. The deep lay beneath everything, holding the quiet remnants of the earliest waters. Above all this, the sky stretched across the heavens, an enormous dome shaped from her upper half. Her presence existed in every part of the world, even if the younger gods rarely acknowledged her directly. But while Tiamat no longer moved through the deep as a living force, her memory rested inside the layers of the cosmos itself. She had become part of the world's structure, and because of that she remained impossible to forget. The younger gods took their roles within the ordered cosmos, growing into responsibilities that defined the seasons, the winds, the rains, and the natural rhythms that people would one day observe. But Tiamat's presence did not vanish, simply because she no longer acted. The early generations of humans who would eventually build cities, temples, and stories lived in a world shaped by her form. They walked on her. They breathed beneath the sky she had become. They drank water that flowed through pathways created from the remnants of her ancient being. Even if they never spoke her name, they lived inside her memory. For the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia, the landscape held meaning long before they built monuments or carved stories into clay. Their world was filled with reminders of ancient forces they did not witness, but deeply sensed. A mountain could not simply be a mountain. A river was not merely a river. The shifting winds, the rising sun, the distant storms, all of these held echoes of something larger, something older. They knew that creation had not always been the way they saw it now. The world carried signs of a beginning that preceded them by ages. As these early people developed writing and structured religion, they began to give shape to the echoes they felt in the world around them. The myth of Tiamat was one of those shapes. It preserved the idea that the universe had once been a single, fluid presence, that creation had emerged from waters older than memory, that order had been carved from something vast, ancient, and not entirely peaceful. Even as the figure of Tiamat evolved in later retellings, the core truth remained. The world they inhabited had been born from the transformation of a primordial being. The temples built across Mesopotamia reflected this truth in ways that were subtle but distinct. Their architecture was not merely functional, it echoed the structure of the cosmos. Each temple rose upward like a miniature version of the world itself. The base represented the earth carved from Tiamat's lower half. The middle levels represented the sky's threshold. The uppermost parts symbolized the heavens, regions originally shaped from her upper body. Even if the builders did not consciously think of Tiamat when designing these structures, the myth's influence shaped the way they interpreted vertical space. To ascend a temple was to move through the layers of the cosmos, retracing the process of creation. Ziggurats, with their stepped designs reaching toward the sky, reflected the same understanding. Each level lifted worshippers closer to the divine, not as a metaphor but as a reenactment of the cosmos' structure. The people who climbed these steps might not have spoken Tiamat's name aloud, yet they climbed through her memory. They ascended through the architecture shaped by the mythic division between heaven and earth, a division rooted in the moment when Marduk split her body to create the universe. The walls of temples often bore carvings of creatures with mixed forms, half serpent, half lion, part bird, part human. These hybrid beings were not mere decorations. They echoed the creatures that surrounded Tiamat in her awakening. While their exact shapes changed from city to city, the core idea remained the same. The ancient world remembered that creation had once been guarded, threatened, or shaped by beings that reflected the turbulence of the earliest cosmos. Even after those primordial creatures disappeared into myth, their forms lingered in art and architecture. They represented forces humans could sense but not fully explain, forces tied to storms, floods, darkness, and the unfathomable depths beneath the visible world. Priests and scribes, responsible for preserving the stories of the gods, often lived and worked in spaces that echoed the structure of the cosmos. The central rooms of temples, places where rituals were performed and offerings were brought, were designed to feel like small pockets of the earliest universe. They were dim, quiet, enclosed. Not places of fear, but places that carried the weight of something older than the gods worshipped within them. These rooms symbolized the womb of creation, the place where existence began. This idea traces directly back to Tiamat, who embodied the earliest waters in which everything took shape. Her presence lived in the architecture even when her name faded from daily rituals. As writing became more widespread, the story of Tiamat found its way into clay tablets. These tablets preserved not only myths but historical records, legal codes, and hymns. Yet among these practical writings, the creation story stood out because it explained why the world existed in its current form. It did not merely recount a battle, it told of transformation, loss, and rebirth. It gave meaning to the structure of the cosmos, and by extension, the structure of society. Kings, priests, farmers, traders, each had a place within a world that had been shaped deliberately from ancient chaos. Even though the figure of Tiamat eventually took on more rigid interpretations in later versions of the myth, the earliest listeners would not have understood her simply as a monster. They would have recognized her as the embodiment of the environment that once held everything. They lived in a world where rivers flooded regularly, where storms swept across the plains, where the sea seemed endless, and where the ground itself could shake without warning. These forces were not evil. They were simply part of existence, vast, unpredictable, and impossible to control. Tiamat reflected that reality. Her story captured the sense that creation was born from forces that could nurture or destroy, depending on how they shifted. Over time, the younger gods, especially Marduk, became more central to rituals, ceremonies, and political identity. Cities aligned themselves with specific deities, drawing power and legitimacy from the gods they worshipped. Marduk, associated with order, leadership, and the shaping of the cosmos, became a symbol of stability. Temples dedicated to him reflected this symbolism with precise design and carefully structured rituals. He had become the central figure in the story of how the cosmos took shape, and his triumph over Tiamat symbolized the victory of order over chaos. But while Marduk's name appeared in hymns and inscriptions, Tiamat was never forgotten completely. Her presence lingered in every retelling of the creation story. Even when scribes presented her in more simplified forms, they could not erase her foundational role. Her story was carved into the structure of the cosmos itself, and because of that, it continued to influence the ways people understood their place in the universe. In many temples, water played a central role in rituals. Basins, channels, and sacred pools were built into the architecture. Some temples had entire rooms devoted to washing, purification, or the symbolic reenactment of creation emerging from water. These practices carried more than practical meaning. They echoed the belief that all life began in the primordial waters, the waters that Tiamat embodied. When worshippers washed their hands, purified their tools, or poured water as offerings, they touched a symbol of the earliest creation. Even without speaking her name, they reenacted the beginning of the universe. Festivals, too, carried echoes of her story. The most famous was the New Year festival in Babylon, where the creation story was recited aloud. Priests would chant the ancient words describing how the cosmos was shaped from the body of the primordial sea. The recitation was not meant to frighten or entertain. It was meant to renew the world, to retell the act of creation so the cosmos would maintain its structure for another year. People believed that by speaking the story, they helped reinforce the order Marduk established. But by speaking the story, they also preserved the memory of Tiamat, because creation could not be retold without acknowledging the world that preceded it. In this way, Tiamat lived on, not as a being worshipped in temples, not as a goddess with offerings and hymns, but as a memory embedded in the very structure of the cosmos, as a presence acknowledged each time the story of creation was spoken, as a force remembered in the shape of the earth, the flow of the rivers, the heights of the mountains, and the curve of the sky. Even though later generations associated her with danger or disorder, the earliest listeners understood that she represented something more fundamental. She was the original environment, the world before the world, the beginning before beginnings, and the presence of that origin never disappeared entirely. As cities rose and fell, as kings ruled and vanished, as temples were built and abandoned, the memory of Tiamat endured. Her story was preserved in clay, carried through centuries of recitations, and reflected in the silent structures that shaped daily life. The echoes of her presence could be found in the places where water met land, in the moments when storms approached, in the quiet spaces of temples, and in the patterns carved across the night sky. Her legacy was not a single story. It was the world itself, and as the cosmos continued to expand through the ages, the memory of the primordial sea lingered in the spaces between myth and existence, waiting quietly in the background as new gods rose, new civilizations flourished, and new stories began to form. The memory of Tiamat did not remain confined to the boundaries of Mesopotamia. Her story, shaped from clay tablets and preserved through rituals, existed long before writing took its final form. And when myths travel, they rarely remain unchanged. They shift, blend, adapt, and resurface in new places under new names. The primordial sea that once gave birth to creation continued to flow through the human imagination long after Tiamat's direct worship had faded. Her echoes appeared in temples far from Babylon, in stories told around fires, in carved stones, and in the symbols people wore for protection long before cities began to rise. The idea of a great mother, an ancient being who existed before the world, who shaped creation through her presence, who gave birth to gods or worlds or both, is one of the most widespread ideas in human mythology. It is older than writing, older than agriculture, older, perhaps, than settlements themselves. It appears in cultures separated by oceans, by mountains, by centuries of migrations and wars. The forms differ, but the underlying idea remains. Before the universe took shape, there was a mother figure so vast and ancient that the world itself emerged from her. Tiamat is among the earliest written memories of that figure, but she's not the only one. Her story belongs to a larger pattern that stretches across civilizations, each telling its own version of the world's first mother, shaped by its environment, beliefs, and experiences. In Egypt, long before the pyramids rose from the desert, people worshipped a goddess whose name meant the one who is all. She was not shaped from anger or chaos. She was the waters that covered the world before the first mound of earth emerged. She was limitless, formless, beyond definition. Later generations would call her Nun, the primordial waters of creation. The universe began when light pierced her darkness, but she remained infinite and eternal, surrounding everything that existed. The Egyptians did not imagine the beginning as an explosion or a sudden shape. They imagined it as a slow rising of land from an endless ocean, a vision that echoes Tiamat's earliest form, the waters from which everything took shape. Across the Mediterranean in Greece, another memory surfaced in the stories told by poets. They spoke of Gaia, the Earth Mother who appeared after chaos. She was solid and fertile, the foundation of existence. But even before Gaia emerged, there was a vast, undefined presence, a formless expanse that resembled the early waters of Tiamat's world. Chaos was not emptiness. It was the space before form, the place from which the world drew its first shapes. When Gaia appeared, she did not create the world alone. She gave rise to the sky, to mountains, to the sea, and from her came generations of gods, each carrying pieces of her essence. Gaia was not shaped from battle. She was shaped from the emergence, but the role she played echoed the same idea, a being who exists before structure, who becomes the medium through which creation appears. In the far north, long before runes were carved into wood or stone, the Norse people told of a primeval void named Ginnungagap. Into that void, a great being emerged from the collision of cold and fire, Ymir, the first giant. Ymir was not a goddess, yet his role mirrored Tiamat's in surprising ways. His body, once he fell, became the world. His flesh became the earth. His bones became mountains. His blood formed the seas. His skull became the sky. Here, too, creation was shaped not from nothing, but from the transformation of a primordial being. The world did not appear instantly. It was crafted from the remnants of something vast, ancient, and no longer alive. This idea mirrors Tiamat's story so closely that the resemblance is difficult to dismiss. Different environment, different people, different language, but the same underlying memory. In India, stories preserved through oral tradition long before they were written describe the cosmic waters and the primordial being known as Hiranyagarbha, the golden egg floating in an endless sea. From that egg emerged the first creator, but beneath the egg lay the waters, ancient and silent, the same waters that appear in myth after myth. Later texts expanded this idea into the tale of Purusha, a cosmic being whose body became the universe. Gods, animals and humans were formed from his limbs, his breath, his mind, his essence. The pattern repeats. Creation arises from a being so immense that the world itself is fashioned from their transformation. In China, one of the oldest creation myths begins with a giant named Pangu emerging from a cosmic egg that held the mixed elements of existence. When Pangu grew and eventually died, his body became the world. The mountains, rivers, forests, winds, clouds. His eyes became the sun and moon, his breath became the winds, his blood became rivers, his hair became stars. Again the world is built from the body of a primordial being. Again creation emerges not from nothing, but from transformation. And beneath all of this lies the presence of a great mother figure, Nuwa, who shaped the first humans from clay, mirroring the idea that life is formed from the earth shaped by an earlier being. Far to the west, long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, the Maya told stories of a great sea that existed before the world began. From this sea rose the creators, divine beings who shaped land from the waters, carving mountains and valleys. The sea remained beneath everything, a reminder that the world rested on an ancient foundation. Even here, far from the plains of Mesopotamia, the idea persisted. Creation does not emerge from emptiness. It emerges from water, from a force older than land, older than sky, older than the world itself. In the Pacific Islands, from Hawaii to Samoa to Fiji, people told stories of a deep ocean that existed before the gods. From that ocean came beings who shaped land, sky, and stars. Some spoke of a great mother whose body was the sea. Others described an ocean goddess whose children became the first islands. These myths were not simply symbolic. They reflected the environment in which these cultures lived. Water defined their world. It brought life and danger. It shaped their understanding of creation, just as it shaped the story of Tiamat. Even in places where writing came late, the idea of the primordial mother survived. In parts of Africa, stories passed through generations describe a great mother who existed before all things. She carried the seeds of creation within her. When she opened her body, the world emerged. Land, animals, humans. In some traditions, she became the earth itself. In others, she vanished into the sky, leaving her essence in the world she had formed. The details shifted, but the central idea remained. Existence begins with a mother. Anthropologists and historians often talk about this pattern as though it emerged independently in each culture. But the repetition is too widespread to ignore. Civilizations separated by vast distances, with no shared contact, arrived at the same idea, that the world began with a being so immense, so ancient, that her presence could not be separated from creation itself. Whether she was a goddess, a giant, an ocean, a void, or a cosmic egg, she carried the same role, the world's first environment, the medium through which everything else took shape. The idea of the Great Mother is older than writing because it speaks to something people sensed long before they developed explanations. They saw that life emerged from mothers. They saw that birth required a vessel. They saw that seeds grew in the earth. They saw rivers bring fertility to dry lands. They saw storms rise from the sea. They understood that creation always came from something larger, older, more powerful than the beings it produced. It made sense to imagine that the universe followed the same pattern. Tiamat, in her earliest form, fit this understanding perfectly. She was the primordial waters from which everything emerged. She was not merely a character in a myth. She was the environment that made creation possible. Her transformation into the structure of the world reflected the idea that ancient forces did not disappear. They changed. They shaped reality. They remained present in ways people could see, feel, and experience. As cultures evolved, some emphasized the nurturing aspect of the Great Mother. Others emphasized her capacity for destruction. Most recognized both. They understood that creation and destruction were not separate forces. They were part of the same cycle. The sea could nurture, but it could also erase entire settlements. The earth could provide food, but it could also cause famine. Storms could bring rain, but they could also bring ruin. The Great Mother represented the full spectrum of the natural world, not a single aspect. Over time, as societies grew more structured and political systems evolved, the role of the Great Mother shifted. Male gods associated with order, law, sky, and structure became more prominent. Kings preferred gods who resembled them, figures of authority, hierarchy, and stability. Myths were rewritten to emphasize the triumph of order over chaos, of structure over wildness. Tiamat's story was shaped by this shift. Her role transformed from a primordial environment into a symbol of disorder. But even as scribes altered her portrayal, they could not erase her origin. She remained the mother of creation, the being whose body became the world. The Great Mother persisted even when her name changed. She lived in the earth beneath people's feet. She lived in the water that shaped their fields. She lived in the storms that reminded them of forces beyond their control. She lived in the cycles of seasons, growth, decay, and renewal. People did not need her myth to know she existed. They saw her everywhere. And as civilizations rose and fell, the memory of that ancient presence moved quietly through history. It appeared in symbols carved into stone. It appeared in rituals performed at dawn. It appeared in stories told to children. It appeared in the design of temples that reached upward to mirror the structure of the world. Even in cultures that no longer spoke her name, the idea remained. Tiamat's story was one version of much older truth, a truth carried across continents and centuries. That creation begins with something vast, that the world is shaped from the remnants of an ancient force, and that the memory of that force never disappears completely. As the cosmos continued through ages, the Great Mother remained, not as a figure demanding worship or fear, but as a quiet presence beneath the surface of countless stories, cultures, and beliefs. Her memory lived not only in myths, but in the structure of the world itself. And wherever people looked at the land, the sea, the sky, or the cycles of nature, they saw echoes of the being who came before all things. And as stories continued to move from generation to generation, the memory of the First Mother drifted quietly through time, carrying with it the ancient truth that the world itself was born from the transformation of something immeasurably old. When ancient storytellers recited the tale of Tiamat, they were not trying to describe molecular chemistry or plate tectonics. They were not attempting to explain the movement of galaxies or the composition of the early atmosphere. They were doing something far older than scientific inquiry, something rooted in instinct rather than calculation. They were trying to understand why there is a world at all, why life feels suspended between order and uncertainty, and why the ocean seems older than the land it surrounds. Their myth was not a literal record of the cosmos, but it was not mere imagination either. It was a way of exploring questions that were too large, too distant, and too deep for words alone. In the centuries that followed, humans developed tools that the earlier civilizations could never have imagined. Telescopes that reached beyond the sky, instruments that picked up the faint radiation left behind from the birth of the universe, microscopes that revealed patterns of life too small for the naked eye. With every new discovery, the story of creation grew more detailed, more complex and more grounded in measurable evidence. Yet strangely, the deeper science went, the more it circled back toward ideas the ancient world had already intuited in symbolic form. It seemed as if myth and science had been walking on opposite sides of the same valley, occasionally glancing across and realizing they were not as far apart as they thought. The old story of Tiamat described creation arising from a vast formless sea, a water-bound world without boundaries, shape, or stability. The earlier scientists, thousands of years later, would describe the origin of life in terms that echoed this vision. They spoke of oceans so ancient that their depths carried the memory of Earth's earliest chemistry. They discovered hydrothermal vents, fissures in the seafloor where minerals and heat created pockets of energy capable of shaping the first organic molecules. They found that life most likely began not on land, but in the deep, in environments where heat and water collided. Long before humans could measure such things, myth had already imagined the sea as the first womb. Tiamat's story described creation emerging from something older than the gods themselves. Science described life emerging from elements older than the Earth itself. Carbon forged in the hearts of dying stars, oxygen released by the earliest microbes, hydrogen carried from the dawn of the universe. Both perspectives recognize that existence came from something earlier, something vast, something that held potential long before it took shape. The idea of a universe born from a single moment of transformation also appears in myth. In Tiamat's case, the transformation came through division, her body becoming sky, earth, and the structure of the cosmos. In scientific terms, creation began with expansion, not division, but the pattern is similar. Something singular became something multiple. Something unified became the source of diversity. Whether told through poetry or physics, the story begins the same way. The universe did not always look the way it does now. It changed. As science developed a clearer picture of these changes, it uncovered processes that the ancient world could not have imagined. Stars formed from collapsing clouds of gas. Planets coalesced from dust swirling around young suns. Oceans condensed from vapor as the early Earth cooled. Yet even these discoveries carried an unexpected familiarity. The idea of land rising from water appears in cultures across the planet not because people saw it happen, but because something in the environment hinted at that memory. Many places were once underwater. Seas receded. Rivers carved new paths. Land rose and fell with tectonic shifts. The world changed shape over millennia, and people sensed that change long before they understood its cause. Myths captured these observations without graphs or equations. They expressed truth through story because story was the most powerful language early humans possessed. Myth said, the world emerged from water. Science said, the world cooled from molten rock, and the earliest life formed in oceans. Side by side, the difference is one of detail, not direction. The clash between Tiamat and Marduk, presented as a cosmic battle, also mirrors something that science eventually revealed. Creation is not gentle. It involves violence on scales so large that no ancient civilization could have described them literally. Stars explode, planets collide, asteroids strike forming worlds, continents break apart, mountains rise when plates crash together. Life itself evolves through conflict between organisms and their environments. Creation, in the scientific view, is formed through both cooperation and destruction. Tiamat's story captures that understanding symbolically. The transformation of her body into the structure of the world reflects how destruction in nature often leads to formation. Even the monstrous beings that surrounded Tiamat echo something real. When early life formed, it was not gentle or familiar. It was microscopic, volatile, and shaped by chemistry so intense that it could never survive in the calm environments humans inhabit today. The deep ocean vents where life may have begun are home to creatures that look like they stepped out of myth. Worms with no eyes, shrimp that sense heat instead of light, microbes that survive temperatures hotter than boiling water. The idea that creation emerged in the presence of strange beings is not strange at all. It reflects a truth. The earliest world was filled with life forms that would appear monstrous to human eyes. Myth expressed this through language that captured emotion rather than measurement. It said that Tiamat created creatures of storm, venom, and shifting form. Science said that ancient life evolved in extreme environments, adapting to heat, pressure, and chemical landscapes unlike anything on the surface. The difference lies in framing, not in the underlying insight. Another connection appears in the idea of the universe having layers. Tiamat's body became the sky, the earth, and the deep. Ancient people saw the world in stratified structure because that was what they experienced. Stars above, soil underfoot, water below. Science revealed that the cosmos is also layered, though on scales impossible for early humans to perceive. The atmosphere has layers. The Earth's crust, mantle, and core form separate regions. The universe itself has structure, clusters of galaxies, filaments, empty regions where almost nothing exists. Myth and science both describe a world that is not uniform, but organized in ways that reflect its origins. When people eventually built temples, they unknowingly mirrored these layers in architecture. Each level of a ziggurat corresponded to a part of the cosmos. Priests moved through symbolic regions as they ascended. Science, in its own way, reveals that humans continue to recreate the structure of the cosmos in everything from city planning to data models. Our minds seem naturally drawn to layered patterns because the world that shaped us carries that form. Tiamat's transformation into the world also reflects a scientific truth. Everything in the universe comes from something else. Nothing appears from emptiness. The carbon in human bodies was formed inside ancient stars. The iron in blood came from supernova explosions. The oxygen we breathe was produced by microbes billions of years ago. Life is built from the remains of earlier forms. Myth expresses this through the imagery of Tiamat's body becoming mountains and rivers. Science expresses it through astrophysics. The idea is the same. We are shaped from ancient matter. As science uncovered the origins of the Earth, it discovered something even more striking. The oceans that cover most of the planet came from sources older than the solar system itself. Some water arrived on comets formed in the early days of the universe. Some came from minerals inside the planet. In either case, water predates the land it surrounds, just as Tiamat's waters existed before the world formed from her body. The myth captured an ancient truth. Water is older, deeper, and more fundamental than the terrain that rests upon it. The idea that the world rests on the transformation of something primordial also appears in geology. Continents formed from molten rock cooled over millions of years. Mountains formed where plates collided. Valleys and basins formed where plates separated. The Earth was not crafted gently. It was shaped through processes that involved immense pressure, heat, and collision. Marduk's shaping of Tiamat's body into mountains and rivers is a metaphorical mirror of how geology actually works. The myth expresses the emotional experience of seeing landscapes carved by forces beyond human control. Even the idea that Tiamat became the sky holds a scientific echo. The atmosphere formed from gases released by volcanic activity, cometary impacts, and the earliest organisms. The sky is not separate from the Earth. It is the exhalation of the planet itself. In this sense, the sky truly did come from the Earth's body, though not in the literal way the myth describes. Early listeners did not know the chemistry behind atmospheric formation, but they understood that the sky was connected to the world below. Their way of expressing that connection was through the transformation of a primordial being. The more science uncovered about early life, the more it returned to a theme the ancient world knew instinctively. The environment shapes creation. Everything that exists is tied to the conditions that produced it. The earliest oceans shaped early organisms. The changing atmosphere shaped evolution. The shifting continents shaped migration, extinction, and adaptation. In myth, Tiamat is the environment itself. Her transformation into the world expresses the idea that the environment is not separate from life. It is the source of life. As humans grew more knowledgeable, they developed scientific models that described how species change across time. They discovered evolutionary trees, genetic patterns, and the deep history preserved in DNA. But in a broad sense, the story remained the same. All life emerged from a single ancient source that carried the potential for everything that came after. Myth expressed that through the figure of a mother. Science expressed it through molecular pathways and shared ancestry. Both voices pointed in the same direction. Life has a common origin. The myth of Tiamat also carried another truth, one that scientists often reach in moments when their instruments reveal the vastness of the cosmos. The universe is enormous, unpredictable, and filled with forces far beyond human control. Storms on Jupiter could swallow Earth entirely. Black holes can warp space itself. Supernovae release more energy than the sun will emit in its entire lifetime. When ancient people imagined Tiamat as a vast ocean filled with unpredictable forces, they were trying to describe the experience of living in a world that can both nurture and destroy. Science, thousands of years later, describes cosmic events in technical terms, yet the emotional impact remains similar. The universe is beautiful, but it is not gentle. Because of that, the myth carries a comfort that scientific explanation alone cannot provide. It gives the chaos a shape. It gives uncertainty a form. It gives the ancient fear of the unknown a story. When people heard of Tiamat rising, they understood that the deep could be threatening. When they heard of Marduk shaping her into the world, they understood that creation required courage, purpose, and transformation. Science reveals the mechanics of these processes, but myth addresses the experience of living through them. In the modern world, with satellites orbiting the Earth and rovers exploring distant planets, the origin of creation can be described in extraordinary detail. Yet people still feel drawn to stories that offer meaning, not just measurement. The myth of Tiamat endures because it offers a way to understand existence that complements scientific explanation instead of replacing it. It reminds us that humanity has always searched for a way to understand its place in the universe, whether through ritual, observation, or stories whispered beside the fire. As science continues to explore the farthest reaches of space and the deepest layers of the ocean, the questions asked by the ancient world remain. Where did everything begin? What shaped the world? What forces existed before us? What will remain after us? Myth answers these questions through narrative. Science answers them through evidence. But both approaches carry the same quiet wonder, the same sense of awe, the same recognition that creation is vast and mysterious. And as the ancient story continues to drift through time, it offers a reminder that even as our methods of understanding evolve, the search for origins remains one of the oldest and most human pursuits of all. When people in the ancient world shaped their earliest myths, they were not only describing forces outside themselves, they were also describing something inside themselves that they did not have modern language for. The story of Tiamat, preserved in clay and memory, was more than a recount of how the world began. It was a reflection of how humans understood their own origins long before science provided the details. And even now, after millennia of discoveries, explanations, and shifting beliefs, the imprint of the first goddess still lingers in ways many people never fully realize. Her presence remains in our stories, in our imaginations, in the ways we speak about nature and creation, and in the quiet parts of ourselves that still respond to the idea of something ancient and vast underlying existence. People living thousands of years ago looked at the world around them and recognized that life came from something. They saw that water shaped everything. They saw that storms carried both danger and renewal. They saw that birth required a body capable of carrying life until it emerged. They saw that existence depended on cycles that repeated themselves but never looked exactly the same. These observations shaped the way they understood the universe. They believed that the first force to hold existence must have been something capable of nurturing, carrying, and transforming, and so they imagined a mother, not in the human sense but in the cosmic one, a presence that existed before all things, a presence whose transformation made the world possible. Tiamat held that role in Mesopotamia. She was not a figure defined by personality. She was a force defined by environment. Her story captured something early humans sensed instinctively, that the world emerged from a single ancient source, and that the materials of creation had been present long before land, sky, or the younger gods appeared. Even when later generations turned her into a figure of disorder or conflict, the core truth remained. She was the beginning before beginnings. That idea has endured far longer than the tablets that recorded her name. People still talk about the world with language shaped by this early understanding. They say the ocean is alive. They speak of storms as if they have moods. They describe the earth as a mother, even when they do not believe in literal gods. They use phrases that echo the ancient sense that nature is not separate from us, but part of us, carrying history that existed long before humans appeared. These tendencies do not come from nowhere. They come from the stories humans have carried for thousands of years, stories that were originally told to explain a world that was still new to them, stories that captured emotional truths in the absence of scientific ones. And even now, when people have more knowledge than any earlier civilization could imagine, they still reach for the language of myth when describing forces too large or too complex to fully understand. When a volcano erupts, people describe it as angry. When a hurricane forms, they describe it as powerful, unpredictable, or restless. When the ocean shifts, they say it is changing temperament. They know, scientifically, that these forces do not feel emotions, yet they continue to speak about them as if they do. This is not superstition, it is instinct. Deep down, humans still respond to the world the way their earliest ancestors did, by recognizing the presence of something vast and ancient that shapes existence in ways beyond their control. This instinct is part of Tiamat's legacy. Her story captured a truth that people still feel, even if they no longer attach a name to it. The world is alive with forces older than humanity, and those forces cannot be fully separated from the origins of life. When people feel humbled by the ocean, or overwhelmed by a storm, they are experiencing something that earlier civilizations tried to express through myth. They felt the presence of something immense, and they used stories to give shape to that feeling. Even the structure of human imagination carries remnants of the first goddess. When children draw worlds, they often begin with oceans, suns, clouds, and mountains. They rarely picture empty space. They picture environments filled with movement, life, and recognizable shapes. When they imagine the beginning of something, they often imagine water or darkness gradually filling with light. These patterns are not taught. They arise naturally, as if humanity has carried a quiet memory through generations, a memory of how people once understood creation. Modern science has explained many of the processes that shape the universe, and those explanations have given people a deeper understanding of how the world formed. Yet even scientists often speak with wonder about the early Earth, describing the ancient oceans as primordial and the formation of life as an emergence. These words echo the old stories more than they differ from them. Scientists no longer describe the earliest waters as a goddess, but they recognize the same truth, that life began in environments older and more complex than anything humans could have imagined without scientific tools. This continuing sense of awe reflects more than intellectual curiosity. It reflects something emotional. People respond to the vastness of the sea, the weight of mountains, and the stillness of deep night with a feeling that is difficult to put into words. It is not fear and not reverence, but something between the two. It is the recognition that these forces existed long before us and will continue long after us. It is the recognition that the world's foundations were shaped by forces we can understand in parts, but never fully control. Early people explained this feeling by imagining a mother so ancient that the world itself came from her. That idea has not disappeared. It has simply changed form. People still talk about the earth as if it carries memory. They talk about the ocean as if it holds secrets. They talk about the stars as if they remember the beginning of time. They describe natural forces as if they were living beings, not because they believe they are, but because this language expresses something deeper than observation. Tiamat's story is one of the earliest examples of this impulse. It preserved the idea that the universe is not lifeless. It has roots. It has history. It has an origin that can be felt even when it cannot be seen. And because of that, her presence has remained quietly in human imagination long after people stopped carving her name into clay. Her influence also appears in the way people understand themselves. Whenever humans try to explain their place in the world, they often return to the language of connection. They say all life is related. They say humans are children of the earth. They say we carry ancient origins in our bodies. These ideas are scientifically accurate. Every organism on the planet shares ancestry, and every element in the human body was formed long before the earth existed. Yet they also echo mythic thinking. They express a sense that humanity is not separate from creation, but part of it. This sense of belonging is older than science. It reflects an understanding carried through stories like Tiamat's, stories that taught people that they emerged from the same forces that shaped the world. When people feel at home near water, when they feel calm in forests, when they feel small beneath the stars, they are responding to something that myth explained long before science confirmed it. That humans are shaped from the same matter that forms the world, and that the memory of this origin remains inside us even when we do not think about it consciously. The story of Tiamat also explains why humans feel drawn to cycles of renewal. The idea that creation arises from transformation appears in countless myths, not because people try to imitate Mesopotamian stories, but because they recognize cycles in nature. Seasons shift, plants grow and die, rivers flood and recede. People are born, grow older and disappear, leaving room for new generations. These patterns made early humans understand that creation is not a single event. It happens continuously, shaped by forces older than memory. Tiamat's transformation into the world reflected this observation. Her body became mountains, rivers, sky and earth. Her presence continued even after her form changed. She did not vanish. She became the environment for everything that followed. This idea helped early people understand the world as a place where change does not erase the past but builds upon it. Even now, people respond deeply to this idea. They talk about their ancestors living within them. They say the past shapes the present. They understand that what came before does not disappear, but influences what comes after. This emotional instinct mirrors the mythic truth expressed in Tiamat's story. The world is built from what existed earlier, not from nothing. Tiamat's legacy also persists in the way humans respond to water. People are drawn to it instinctively. They settle near rivers, they gather at coasts, they travel to lakes for peace or reflection. They feel comforted by the sound of waves, fascinated by the depth of the sea, and humbled by storms. Water shapes human emotion in ways that extend far beyond survival needs. This connection reflects the ancient understanding that the earliest world was water, and that water is the origin of life. Science has confirmed this, but humans felt it long before they could measure it. They knew that life depended on rivers and rainfall. They knew that ocean currents shaped weather. They knew that their own bodies carried the memory of water in their veins. Tiamat's presence in myth echoes this recognition. The first environment was water, and humans have never forgotten that truth, even when they no longer speak of the primordial sea as a goddess. The story of the first goddess still breathes in us, not because people consciously choose to remember her, but because her story captured something about the world that remains true. Creation is ancient, it is complex, it is shaped by forces that existed long before humanity, and it is carried forward through transformation rather than permanence. People today live in cities far removed from the landscapes that shaped early myths. They study science instead of reciting stories. They look to research instead of ritual to understand the world. Yet the emotional truths expressed in the earlier stories continue to influence the way they see themselves and the universe around them. They still feel awe in the presence of nature. They still search for meaning in the origins of the world. They still look for connection between themselves and forces larger than their own lives. That search is one of the oldest parts of being human. It began long before writing, long before cities, long before temples. It began when early people looked at the vast world around them and sensed that it had come from something more ancient than they could comprehend. They expressed this through the figure of a first mother whose transformation shaped the world. And even though her name may no longer be spoken in daily life, the idea she represents remains alive in human memory, in the stories we tell, in the feelings nature evokes, in the ways we describe the world, and in the quiet understanding that life is part of something far older and deeper than the brief span of a single lifetime. The first goddess still breathes in us, because the world she once represented continues to shape the ways we think, feel, and imagine. And as humans continue to explore their origins through science, story, and reflection, the memory of that ancient presence drifts quietly beneath the surface of awareness, connecting the far past with the present in ways that remain as deep and fluid as the waters that once held the earliest universe.